Welcome to Quick Classic Books, where we take the greatest stories ever written and trim them down for the modern audience, keeping all the essential plot, characters, and atmosphere, while making these timeless tales more accessible than ever. Today we present our adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. While the original Victorian novel can feel dense and overwhelming to today's readers, our version captures every crucial moment of this immortal story in a streamlined, engaging format that brings the terror and excitement to vivid life. In the spring of 1893, young solicitor Jonathan Harker travels to the remote mountains of Transylvania on what he believes is a simple business assignment. What he discovers in the ancient Castle Dracula will challenge everything he knows about the nature of life, death, and the thin veil that separates our world from unspeakable evil. This is the complete chronicle of the vampire's invasion of England. From Jonathan's terrifying captivity to Lucy Westenra's tragic fate, from the mysterious arrival of the ship Demeter to the final hunt through Victorian London's gaslit streets, we've preserved every essential scene and character while creating a more direct, immediate storytelling experience that honors Stoker's original vision. Prepare yourself for a tale of blood and shadow, love and sacrifice, where the impossible becomes terrifyingly real and where the fate of England itself hangs in the balance. This is Quick Classic Books' adaptation of Dracula, Chapter 1, The Journey into Darkness. In the late spring of 1893, when Queen Victoria's empire stretched across the globe and the gaslight of London represented the pinnacle of modern civilization, a young English solicitor named Jonathan Harker embarked upon what would become the most harrowing journey of his life. Armed with nothing more than his leather briefcase, his professional credentials, and the unshakable confidence of a man raised in the rational world of Victorian England, he traveled eastward through the wild, untamed landscapes of Eastern Europe toward a destination that would challenge everything he believed about the nature of reality itself. Jonathan Harker was 28 years old, recently qualified as a solicitor, and eager to prove himself worthy of partnership in the respected London firm of Hawkins & Company. His assignment seemed straightforward enough. Travel to the remote region of Transylvania to assist a wealthy nobleman with the purchase of an English estate. The client, who had identified himself only as Count Dracula, had expressed particular interest in acquiring Carfax, a substantial but deteriorating property near London. The legal work promised to be lucrative, and Jonathan saw it as an opportunity to establish his reputation and secure his future with his beloved fiancée, Mina Murray. The journey began pleasantly enough. Jonathan took the train from London to Paris, then onward through the great cities of Europe, Munich, Vienna, Budapest, each mile carrying him further from the familiar comforts of home and deeper into a world where ancient superstitions still held sway over the minds of men. As he traveled, Jonathan maintained a detailed journal, recording his observations for Mina's amusement and for his own professional records. He wrote of the changing landscapes, the exotic foods he sampled at roadside inns, the curious customs of the various peoples he encountered along the way. But as his train carried him into the mountainous regions of Transylvania, Jonathan began to notice a change in the atmosphere around him. The other passengers grew quieter, more subdued, casting nervous glances toward the windows as the landscape outside became increasingly wild and desolate. When he mentioned his destination to fellow travelers, their reactions were uniformly disturbing. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers in languages he could not understand. Others pressed religious medals and crucifixes into his hands, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed entirely disproportionate to a simple business errand. At the town of Bistritz, where he was to catch a coach for the final leg of his journey to Castle Dracula, Jonathan found a letter waiting for him at the inn. Written in an archaic but elegant hand, it welcomed him to the region and instructed him to wait for a private carriage that would convey him to the castle. The letter was signed with a flourish, "Your friend, D." The innkeeper, a stout woman with work-worn hands and worry lines etched deep around her eyes, read the letter over Jonathan's shoulder and immediately began speaking rapidly in her native tongue, shaking her head vigorously and making the sign of the cross repeatedly. When Jonathan asked for a translation, she could only manage broken English, but her meaning was clear enough. She was begging him not to go. She pressed a silver crucifix into his palm, closing his fingers around it with both of her hands, and looking into his eyes with an expression of such genuine terror that Jonathan felt his first stirring of unease. As night fell, the promised carriage arrived, a large, old-fashioned vehicle drawn by 4 black horses, their eyes reflecting the lamplight with an almost supernatural gleam. The driver was a tall figure wrapped in a great black cloak, his face hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange accent that Jonathan could not place, and his words seemed to echo oddly in the mountain air. The driver took Jonathan's luggage with ease, lifting the heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, and gestured for him to take his seat inside the carriage. The journey up the mountain pass was unlike anything Jonathan had ever experienced. The road was treacherous, winding through steep ravines and along precipitous cliffs where a single misstep by the horses would send them plummeting into the abyss below. Yet the driver navigated these hazards with supernatural skill, urging the horses onward at breakneck speed through the darkness. The wind howled around them like the voices of the damned, and wolves could be heard calling to one another across the desolate peaks, their cries echoing off the ancient stone in a chorus of primitive wildness that made Jonathan's blood run cold. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Jonathan began to notice strange phenomena that his rational mind struggled to explain. The driver seemed to possess an uncanny ability to see in the darkness, guiding the horses along paths that were invisible to Jonathan's eyes. More disturbing still, when the carriage encountered a pack of wolves blocking their way, the driver stepped down and approached the snarling beasts without fear. Rather than attacking him, the wolves seemed to bow before him, slinking away into the shadows as though acknowledging his dominance over them. The temperature continued to drop as they ascended, and Jonathan pulled his coat tighter around himself, grateful for the warmth of the traveling rug the driver had provided. But when his fingers accidentally brushed against the driver's hand as the man adjusted the rug, Jonathan recoiled in shock. The man's flesh was as cold as marble, and his skin had the waxy texture of something long dead. When Jonathan looked up into the driver's face, hoping to catch a glimpse of his features, he found himself staring into eyes that reflected the moonlight like those of a wild animal, glowing with an inner fire that spoke of appetites and hungers no civilized man should possess. Castle Dracula loomed before them like a vision from a fevered nightmare, its massive walls rising from the very edge of a precipice that dropped away into invisible depths below. The ancient fortress seemed to have been carved from the living rock of the mountain itself, its towers and battlements silhouetted against the star-filled sky like the claws of some gigantic beast. No lights welcomed the weary traveler. No signs of habitation could be seen in any of the countless windows that stared down like empty eye sockets from the stone facade. The entire structure exuded an aura of such profound desolation and decay that Jonathan felt his courage falter for the first time since leaving London. The carriage drew to a halt before a massive wooden door, bound with iron and studded with nails black with age. The driver stepped down and opened the carriage door for Jonathan, but when the young solicitor turned to thank him, he found himself alone. The mysterious figure had vanished as silently as a shadow, leaving Jonathan standing before the forbidding entrance to Castle Dracula with only his luggage and his rapidly diminishing confidence for company. For several long minutes, Jonathan stood in the courtyard, uncertain whether to approach the door or wait for someone to acknowledge his arrival. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant howling of wolves and the mournful whisper of wind through the castle's ancient stones. Finally, summoning his courage, he walked to the great door and lifted the heavy iron knocker, letting it fall against the wood with a sound that echoed through the courtyard like thunder. Almost immediately, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps from within, slow, measured steps that seemed to echo with the weight of centuries. Heavy bolts were drawn back, massive keys turned in ancient locks, and finally the great door swung open with a groan of protest from its iron hinges. The man who stood before Jonathan was tall and imposing, dressed in black from head to foot, without a single spot of color to relieve the somber effect. His hair was white as snow, swept back from a high, intellectual forehead that spoke of noble breeding and ancient lineage. His face was strong and aquiline, with a thin nose, pronounced cheekbones, and a mouth that was both cruel and sensual. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, deep-set and burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to Jonathan's soul, as though this stranger could read every thought, every secret, every fear that lay hidden in the young man's heart. The Count, For Jonathan had no doubt that this was indeed Count Dracula himself, was a study in contrasts. His manner was courtly and refined, speaking of centuries of noble breeding, yet there was something fundamentally wrong about him that Jonathan could not immediately identify. His skin was pale to the point of being nearly translucent, and his hands, when he gestured, revealed fingernails that were unusually long and pointed, more like the claws of some predatory beast than the manicured nails of a gentleman. "Welcome to my home," Count Dracula said, his voice carrying a musical accent that spoke of Eastern European nobility, yet tinged with something else, something ancient and otherworldly that made the hair on the back of Jonathan's neck stand on end. "Enter freely and of your own will. Once you have entered, you become a part of what goes on here." Jonathan stepped across the threshold and immediately felt a change in the atmosphere around him. The air inside the castle was thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of age and decay and something else, something that reminded him of the charnel house, of death and corruption and things better left undisturbed. The Count took up Jonathan's luggage with ease, carrying the heavy cases as though they were filled with feathers, and led him through a series of long corridors lined with ancient tapestries and suits of armor that seemed to watch their passage with empty, accusing eyes. The room to which Count Dracula conducted his guest was large and well-appointed, with a fire crackling cheerfully in the grate and a table set for dinner. The Count gestured for Jonathan to be seated, then took his own place across from him, though Jonathan noticed that no food was placed before his host. Throughout the meal, which consisted of excellent roast chicken, some cheese, and a salad, accompanied by a bottle of Tokay that was easily the finest wine Jonathan had ever tasted, the Count questioned him closely about his journey, about England, and particularly about London. The Count's knowledge of England was extraordinary, almost obsessive in its detail. He spoke of London's streets and districts as though he had walked them himself, knew the names of prominent citizens as though they were personal acquaintances, and displayed a familiarity with English law and custom that was remarkable for someone who claimed never to have left his ancestral home. He was particularly interested in the property at Carfax, asking detailed questions about its location, its proximity to London, and the surrounding neighborhood. As the evening progressed, Jonathan found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable in his host's presence. The Count never seemed to eat or drink, though he pressed food and wine upon his guest with gracious insistence. His skin remained deathly pale despite the warmth of the fire, and his hands, when they moved into the light, revealed a network of blue veins that stood out starkly against the translucent flesh. Most disturbing of all, when Jonathan happened to glance toward the ornate mirror that hung above the mantelpiece, he saw only his own reflection staring back at him. Count Dracula, who was seated directly across from him in full view of the glass, cast no reflection whatsoever. When Jonathan finally retired to his chamber, exhausted by the long journey and unsettled by his strange host, he found himself unable to sleep. The wind howled around the castle with renewed fury, and strange sounds echoed through the ancient corridors, sounds that might have been footsteps or might have been something else entirely. From somewhere far below came the howling of wolves, but whether they were outside the castle walls or within them, Jonathan could not tell. As dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded, and an unnatural silence settled over Castle Dracula. Jonathan finally managed to fall into a troubled sleep, but his dreams were filled with visions of pale faces and burning eyes, of wolves running through moonlit forests, and of a tall figure in black standing at the edge of a precipice, calling to him in a voice that promised both ecstasy and damnation. When he awoke the next morning, the sun was high in the sky, and a breakfast of coffee, bread, and honey had been laid out for him, though he had heard no servants moving about the castle. A note beside his plate, written in the same elegant hand as the letter he had received in Bistritz, informed him that Count Dracula would be unable to meet with him until evening, as pressing business required his attention during the daylight hours. Jonathan was welcome to explore the castle and its library, but certain areas were to remain off-limits for his own safety. Chapter 2. The Castle of Shadows. Jonathan Harker's first full day in Castle Dracula passed in a strange, dreamlike state that left him questioning his own perceptions of reality. The ancient fortress was a maze of corridors, chambers, and staircases that seemed to defy logical architectural principles. Rooms opened onto other rooms in bewildering succession, some furnished with medieval splendor, others standing empty and forlorn, their walls adorned only with the stains of age and the droppings of countless generations of bats. The library to which Count Dracula had directed him was a scholar's paradise, containing thousands of volumes in dozens of languages, many of them bound in leather so old and cracked that they seemed ready to crumble at a touch. Jonathan found books on law, history, philosophy, and the sciences, but noticed a peculiar preponderance of works dealing with England, its geography, its customs, its people, and particularly its legal system. Maps of London covered one entire wall, marked with notations in the Count's distinctive handwriting, and Jonathan was surprised to discover that his host possessed a more detailed knowledge of English real estate law than many practicing solicitors. As he examined the books and papers, Jonathan began to understand the true scope of Count Dracula's interest in England. This was no simple real estate transaction, but the careful preparation for what could only be described as an invasion. The Count had spent years, perhaps decades, studying his target with the thoroughness of a military strategist planning a campaign. The purchase of Carfax was merely the beginning, the establishment of a beachhead from which further operations could be launched. When evening came and Count Dracula appeared for their second dinner together, Jonathan attempted to discuss the legal documents they needed to complete. The Count proved to be a demanding client, insisting on understanding every clause and provision in minute detail. His questions revealed a knowledge of English law that was both comprehensive and disturbingly practical, as though he were planning for contingencies that a normal property buyer would never consider. "You English have such interesting customs regarding property ownership," the Count observed, his pale fingers drumming silently on the table's dark wood. "The concept of sanctuary, for instance, the idea that a man's home is his castle, inviolate against intrusion. Such protections could prove useful to someone seeking to establish himself in your country." As the nights passed, for Jonathan quickly learned that his host was strictly nocturnal, disappearing entirely during daylight hours, their conversations took on an increasingly unsettling character. Count Dracula questioned him exhaustively about English social customs, legal procedures, and the daily routines of London's inhabitants. He was particularly interested in the neighborhoods surrounding Carfax, asking detailed questions about who lived there, what their habits were, and how often they ventured out after dark. "London must be a fascinating city at night," the Count mused during one of their conversations. "So many people, so many lives intersecting in the darkness. Tell me, Mr. Harker, do London citizens take adequate precautions against the dangers that lurk in shadow? Are they careful to lock their doors, to avoid wandering alone through empty streets, to keep their windows securely fastened against unwelcome visitors?" Jonathan found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with such questions, though he could not have said exactly why. There was something in the Count's tone, in the way his eyes seemed to glow when he spoke of London's nighttime population, that suggested appetites and intentions far removed from legitimate business interests. On his third night in the castle, Jonathan made a discovery that shook him to his very core. Unable to sleep, he had been exploring the castle's endless corridors when he came upon a window that offered a view of the courtyard below. What he saw there defied all rational explanation and haunts his memory still. Count Dracula emerged from a ground-level window and began to crawl down the castle's outer wall, head downward, moving with the fluid grace of some enormous lizard. His black cloak spread out around him like great wings, and in the moonlight his pale face seemed to glow with its own unearthly radiance. Jonathan watched in horrified fascination as his host made his way down the sheer stone face of the castle wall, his fingers and toes finding purchase in cracks and crevices that would have been invisible to human eyes. This was no mere eccentricity of an unusual nobleman. This was something that violated every law of nature, something that belonged to the realm of nightmare rather than waking reality. From that night forward, Jonathan's situation in Castle Dracula took on a decidedly more sinister character. He began to notice that certain doors which had previously been unlocked were now barred against him. The Count's servants, whom he had never seen but whose presence he had inferred from the meals that appeared and the rooms that were cleaned, seemed to have vanished entirely. Most disturbing of all, when he attempted to send letters to Mina and to his employer in London, he discovered that his correspondence was being intercepted and censored. The Count was increasingly forthright about the true nature of their relationship. During one of their evening conversations, when Jonathan expressed a desire to return to England to finalize some details of the property transfer, Count Dracula's facade of hospitality slipped entirely. "But my dear friend," the Count said, his voice carrying a tone of mock concern that barely concealed the threat beneath, "surely you would not wish to leave before our business is entirely concluded. I have found your company so educational, and there is still so much I wish to learn about your country's customs. No, I think it would be best if you remained here as my guest for some time longer. Indeed, I must insist upon it." The way he pronounced the word insist left no doubt in Jonathan's mind that he was now a prisoner in Castle Dracula, though for what purpose he could not imagine. His legal expertise was clearly valuable to the Count, but Jonathan sensed that his usefulness extended beyond mere professional consultation. There was something predatory in the way his host looked at him, something that suggested appetites that had nothing to do with real estate transactions. Jonathan's growing desperation led him to increasingly bold attempts at escape. He explored every corridor, examined every window, tested every door in search of a way out of the castle. But Count Dracula's fortress had been designed to keep people in as well as out, and centuries of experience had taught its master to anticipate and counter every possible escape attempt. It was during one of these nocturnal explorations that Jonathan made a discovery that explained much about his host's true nature, while simultaneously destroying any remaining illusions he might have harbored about Count Dracula's humanity. In a remote wing of the castle, behind a door that had previously been locked, he found a staircase leading down into the castle's depths. Following it with the desperate courage of a man who has nothing left to lose, he discovered a series of underground chambers that had clearly been carved from the living rock centuries ago. The chambers were filled with wooden boxes, great rectangular constructions that reminded Jonathan unpleasantly of coffins. Each box was filled with earth, not the local soil of Transylvania, but earth that had clearly been gathered from many different locations, each sample carefully labeled and stored, as though it possessed some special significance. Some of the boxes had already been sealed and marked for shipment to London, while others remained open, waiting to be filled with their precious cargo. In the center of this underground complex lay a particularly large and ornate box, its wood black with age and carved with symbols that hurt Jonathan's eyes to look upon. This box was different from the others, older, more elaborate, and emanating an aura of ancient malevolence that made the air around it seem thick and oppressive. As Jonathan approached it cautiously, driven by a morbid curiosity that overrode his better judgment, he detected a smell rising from within. The smell of old earth mixed with something else. Something that reminded him of morgues and charnel houses, and things that should have been left to rest in peace. Inside the box, lying as still as death itself, was Count Dracula, but this was not the courtly nobleman who had entertained Jonathan in the castle's dining hall. This was something older and far more terrible, a creature whose true nature was finally revealed in all its horrifying glory. The Count's skin was deathly pale and waxy. His lips were drawn back to reveal teeth that were sharp and pointed like those of a wolf, and his eyes were closed in the sleep of the undead. Most shocking of all, those same lips that had spoken so eloquently of English law and London society were now stained with fresh blood, evidence of feeding that had taken place during the Count's nocturnal wanderings. Jonathan stood frozen in horror, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Count Dracula was not merely an eccentric nobleman with unusual habits. He was something that belonged to the realm of legend and nightmare, a creature that fed upon the blood of the living and possessed powers that mocked the natural order of creation. The boxes of earth, the nocturnal habits, the absence of reflection, everything suddenly made terrible sense. As Jonathan watched in paralyzed fascination, the Count's eyes slowly opened, revealing orbs that burned with an inner fire like coals from the depths of hell. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the gulf that separated the living from the undead, the natural from the supernatural, the hunter from the prey. Then Count Dracula smiled, revealing his predatory fangs in all their terrifying glory, and Jonathan understood with crystal clarity that his time as a guest in Castle Dracula was rapidly drawing to a close. With the desperate strength that comes only from mortal terror, Jonathan fled from that underground chamber, racing through the castle's corridors as though all the demons of hell were pursuing him. Behind him, he could hear the Count's laughter echoing through the ancient stones, a sound that spoke of centuries of hunting and feeding, and the absolute confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. Chapter 3. The Brides of Darkness. Jonathan Harker's discovery of Count Dracula's true nature marked the beginning of the most terrifying period of his captivity in the ancient castle. No longer was he a guest being entertained by an eccentric nobleman. Now he was unmistakably a prisoner, held captive by a creature whose very existence violated every law of nature and reason. The Count made no further attempt to conceal his supernatural nature, and their evening conversations took on a quality of cat and mouse that left Jonathan's nerves shattered and his mind reeling. During the day, when Count Dracula lay in his death-like sleep among the boxes of cursed earth, Jonathan frantically searched for some means of escape from his predicament. He examined every window, tested every door, explored every corridor in the vast castle, but found himself as securely trapped as though he were imprisoned in the deepest dungeon. The windows were too high above the courtyard to offer any hope of survival should he attempt to jump, and besides, they were fitted with bars that had been forged centuries ago and would not yield to his desperate efforts to bend or break them. The doors that led to the outside world were massive affairs of oak and iron, secured with locks that would have challenged the most skilled burglar and guarded by mechanisms that seemed to respond only to the Count's supernatural strength. Even if he could somehow have forced one of these barriers, Jonathan realized that he would then face the problem of descending the castle's walls, which rose sheer from the edge of a precipice that dropped away into depths too dark to fathom. As the days passed, Jonathan noticed changes in his own appearance that filled him with growing alarm. His face had grown gaunt and pale, his eyes had developed a haunted quality that reflected the horrors he had witnessed, and his hands trembled with a nervous exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed able to cure. He found himself starting at shadows, jumping at sounds that might have been nothing more than the wind through the castle's ancient stones, and lying awake at night listening for footsteps that might herald the approach of his supernatural captor. The Count, meanwhile, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in Jonathan's deteriorating condition. During their evening meetings, he would make oblique references to Jonathan's pallor, suggest remedies for his obvious nervousness, and offer observations about the effects of prolonged isolation on the human mind. There was a quality of scientific curiosity in these comments, as though Count Dracula were conducting some sort of experiment, and Jonathan were nothing more than a laboratory specimen whose reactions were being carefully observed and recorded. "You seem distressed, my dear fellow," the Count observed during one particularly difficult evening. "Perhaps the mountain air does not agree with your English constitution, or perhaps it is simply that you are homesick for your beloved London. I confess that I share your eagerness to see that great city, though I suspect my reasons for wishing to visit England may be somewhat different from your own." Jonathan's attempts to learn more about the Count's plans for England were met with responses that were both informative and deeply disturbing. Count Dracula spoke of London as though it were a vast hunting preserve stocked with prey, discussing the city's population with the enthusiasm of a gourmand contemplating a particularly elaborate feast. He had studied the habits of London's citizens with the thoroughness of a predator learning the behavioral patterns of his intended victims, and his knowledge of the city's geography focused particularly on those areas where people might walk alone after dark. "The beauty of a great city like London," the Count mused, "lies not merely in its monuments and institutions, but in the rich variety of life that flows through its streets. Young and old, rich and poor, the innocent and the experienced, all mixing together in the most delightful confusion. And at night, when the gas lamps cast their pools of light separated by such convenient stretches of shadow, the opportunities for social interaction must be almost limitless." The Count's preparations for his journey to England proceeded with methodical efficiency. The boxes of earth were sealed and marked for shipment, arrangements were made for their transportation to London, and detailed plans were laid for establishing the Count's residence at Carfax. Jonathan was forced to use his legal expertise to ensure that all documentation was properly prepared and that Count Dracula's ownership of the property would be unquestioned by English authorities. It was during this period that Jonathan made another discovery that added a new dimension of horror to his already nightmarish situation. While exploring a previously unknown section of the castle in a desperate search for some means of escape, he came upon a doorway that led to what had once been a richly appointed suite of rooms. The chambers were decorated in a style that suggested they had been designed for the comfort of noble ladies, with elegant furniture, elaborate tapestries, and appointments that spoke of luxury and refinement. But these rooms had not been occupied by their intended inhabitants for many years. Dust covered everything like a shroud. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like funeral drapes, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and abandonment. Most disturbing of all, scattered throughout the chambers were items of women's clothing and jewelry, personal effects that suggested the room's former occupants had departed suddenly and without taking their most precious possessions with them. As Jonathan examined these melancholy remains, he began to piece together the tragic history they represented. Count Dracula had clearly entertained female guests in his castle over the years, women who had arrived full of life and beauty but who had never left to return to their homes and families. The jewelry and clothing suggested women of refinement and social position, not peasant girls from the local villages, and the quantity of such items indicated that the Count's hospitality had been extended to many visitors over the decades. Jonathan was still examining these pathetic remnants when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. But these were not the measured steps of Count Dracula that he had learned to recognize and dread. These footsteps were lighter, more graceful, accompanied by the rustle of silk and the soft laughter of feminine voices. Yet there was something wrong with these sounds, something that made the hair on the back of Jonathan's neck stand on end and filled his mouth with the taste of fear. 3 women entered the chamber, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They were incredibly beautiful, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the dim light and hair that cascaded around their shoulders like liquid gold and raven black. Their dresses were of an antique style, but made from fabrics so rich and lustrous that they seemed to have been woven from moonbeams and shadow. But it was their eyes that held Jonathan's attention, eyes that burned with an unholy hunger and promised pleasures that would exact a price no mortal man could afford to pay. The women moved around Jonathan like predators circling their prey, their movements synchronized as though they were dancers performing some ancient and terrible ballet. As they drew closer, he could see that their beauty was not entirely human. Their canine teeth were elongated and pointed, their fingernails were more like claws, and their skin had the translucent quality of marble that had never felt the warmth of living blood flowing beneath its surface. "He is young and strong," said one of the women, her voice like the whisper of silk across bare skin. "There are kisses for us all." "We shall take our time with this one," added another, reaching out to stroke Jonathan's face with fingers that were cold as winter frost. "It has been so long since we have had such entertainment." The third woman said nothing, but her smile revealed fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers in the dim light, and her eyes held a promise of ecstasies that would end in death and damnation. As the 3 creatures closed in around him, Jonathan felt his will beginning to ebb away, replaced by a strange languor that made resistance seem pointless and undesirable. Just as the first of the women leaned down toward Jonathan's throat, her lips parted to reveal the fangs that would deliver the kiss of death. A new voice thundered through the chamber with the force of an avalanche. Count Dracula stood in the doorway, his pale face contorted with rage, and his eyes blazing with an authority that made even these supernatural creatures cower before him. "How dare you touch him?" the Count roared, his voice echoing through the ancient stones with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. "How dare you cast eyes on him when I have forbidden it? This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you shall have to deal with me." The 3 women drew back from Jonathan as though they had been burned, their beautiful faces now twisted with expressions of disappointment and barely suppressed rage. But they did not dare to challenge their master's authority, and after a few moments of tense silence, the first of them spoke in a voice that carried the petulance of a spoiled child denied a promised treat. "You yourself never loved," she said accusingly. "You never love. What do you know of love? And when we are finished with him, may we not have our own lives to live? Must we always hunger while you feast? When do we cease to be your servants and become your companions?" Count Dracula's expression softened slightly at these words, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone of almost paternal affection, though the underlying threat remained unmistakable. "Yes, I too can love," he said, his eyes never leaving the 3 women. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done." The women withdrew with obvious reluctance, but not before each had cast a look of such burning hunger toward Jonathan that he felt his very soul shrivel within him. As their footsteps faded away down the corridor, Count Dracula turned his attention to his prisoner, and Jonathan saw in those terrible eyes a possessiveness that was somehow even more frightening than the predatory lust of the three supernatural women. "They are my children," the Count explained in a conversational tone, as though he were discussing a minor domestic arrangement. "I created them to be my companions in the long centuries of my existence, and they serve me with absolute devotion. But they are young in the ways of our kind, impetuous, and sometimes lacking in proper discipline. They forget that patience is one of the greatest virtues of our species, and that the best pleasures are those that are properly savored rather than hastily consumed." Jonathan found his voice with difficulty, his throat dry as dust and his words coming out as little more than a whisper. What are you?" Count Dracula smiled, revealing his own predatory fangs in all their terrible glory. "I am Dracula," he said simply. "I am the lord of this castle, the master of these lands, and soon to be a resident of your fair England. As for what I am," he paused, seeming to consider how best to explain something that defied explanation. "I am what your ancestors called vampire, what your legends speak of in whispers around winter fires. I am one of the undead, neither fully alive nor completely deceased, sustained by the life force of others and possessed of powers that your modern world has forgotten but not entirely ceased to fear." The Count moved closer to Jonathan, his pale face only inches away, and when he spoke his breath was like the wind from an open grave. "But you need not concern yourself with such theological questions, my dear fellow. Your role in this matter is far simpler. You will continue to assist me with the legal requirements for my establishment in England, and when that work is complete, you will serve me in other ways. Think of it as an extended apprenticeship in matters that are not taught in your English universities." As Count Dracula led Jonathan from that chamber of horrors back to the main section of the castle, the young solicitor's mind reeled with the implications of what he had learned. He was a prisoner not merely of an eccentric nobleman, but of a creature whose very existence violated every principle of natural law. The Count's plans for England were not those of an immigrant seeking a new home, but of a predator preparing to establish new hunting grounds among an unsuspecting population. Most terrifying of all was the realization that Jonathan himself was destined to become something other than human. The Count's words had made it clear that his captivity was not temporary, that he would not be returning to England as the man who had left it. Instead, he would be transformed into something like the three supernatural women he had encountered, beautiful, terrible, and eternally hungry for the blood of the living. Chapter 4. The Voyage of the Demeter. While Jonathan Harker remained trapped in the nightmarish confines of Castle Dracula, Count Dracula himself began the final preparations for his invasion of England. The 50 boxes of Transylvanian earth had been carefully sealed and loaded aboard a ship called the Demeter, a Russian cargo vessel whose captain had agreed to transport the Count's unusual cargo without asking too many questions about its contents or its ultimate destination. Captain Ivan Petrovich was a practical man who had spent 30 years navigating the treacherous waters of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. He had seen enough of the world's strangeness to know that the wisest course was often to accept payment for services rendered without inquiring too deeply into matters that did not directly concern his ship's safety. The nobleman who had chartered space in his hold paid promptly and in gold, which was recommendation enough for any merchant captain worth his salt. The Demeter was a sturdy vessel, built for carrying cargo rather than passengers, with a crew of 12 experienced sailors who had worked together for many voyages. They were rough men, hardened by years of facing the sea's many dangers, but they were competent and reliable. Exactly the sort of crew a captain needed when undertaking a voyage that would take them far from familiar waters. The loading of Count Dracula's cargo had proceeded without incident, though several of the crew members had commented on the unusual weight of the boxes and the strange smell that seemed to emanate from them, despite their being securely sealed. The Count himself had supervised the loading personally, ensuring that each box was placed exactly where he specified and warning the crew in the strongest possible terms against disturbing the cargo during the voyage. These boxes contain items of great antiquity and immense value, the Count had explained to Captain Petrovich. They are extremely fragile and must not be moved or opened under any circumstances. Any man who tampers with my property will answer to me personally, and I assure you that such a reckoning would be most unpleasant for all concerned. There had been something in the way the Count spoke these words, something in the intensity of his gaze and the controlled menace in his voice, that had convinced the captain and his crew to take the warning seriously. The boxes were secured in the ship's hold and left strictly alone, though more than one crew member crossed himself when passing near the cargo area and muttered prayers in languages older than Christianity. The Demeter departed from Varna on a clear morning in early July, with favorable winds and every expectation of a routine voyage to Whitby on the northeast coast of England. For the first several days, everything proceeded exactly as Captain Petrovich had planned. The weather remained fair, the ship made good time, and the crew went about their duties with their usual efficiency and professionalism. It was on the fourth night out from port that the first strange incident occurred. Dmitry Volkov, a seasoned sailor who had been with the ship for over 5 years, failed to report for his watch. When his shipmates went to look for him, they found his bunk empty and his personal effects undisturbed, as though he had simply vanished into thin air. A thorough search of the ship revealed no trace of the missing man, and the crew was forced to conclude that he had somehow fallen overboard during the night, though no one could explain how such an experienced sailor could have met with such an accident in calm seas. Captain Petrovich was troubled by the loss of one of his best men, but maritime accidents were not uncommon, and he saw no choice but to continue the voyage with his reduced crew. He made the appropriate entries in the ship's log and redistributed the watches to compensate for Volkov's absence, though he noticed that the remaining crew members seemed unusually nervous and kept glancing toward the hold where the Count's mysterious cargo lay secured. 2 nights later, another crew member disappeared under similarly inexplicable circumstances. This time it was Sergei Popov, the ship's cook, a fat, jolly man who was popular with the entire crew and had no enemies or troubles that might have driven him to suicide. Like Volkov before him, Popov simply vanished between one watch and the next, leaving behind only his apron hanging on its accustomed hook and a pot of stew that was still warm on the galley stove. The crew was now thoroughly alarmed, and several of the men approached Captain Petrovich with their concerns. They spoke of strange sounds coming from the hold during the night, of shadows moving on deck when no one should have been there, and of an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Some of the more superstitious sailors muttered about curses and sea demons, while others suggested that there might be a stowaway aboard who was responsible for the disappearances. Captain Petrovich was a rational man who had little patience for supernatural explanations, but he was also an experienced seaman who knew better than to ignore his crew's concerns entirely. He ordered a thorough search of the ship, paying particular attention to any areas where a stowaway might be hiding. But the Demeter was not a large vessel, and every corner was familiar to men who had sailed her for years. No stowaway was found, and the mysterious disappearances continued. On the 7th night of the voyage, the first mate, Boris Kirilenko, a man whose courage and competence had never been questioned in 20 years at sea, came to the captain's cabin in a state of extreme agitation. His face was pale and drawn, his hands trembled as he spoke, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "Captain," Kirilenko said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is something aboard this ship that should not be. I have seen it with my own eyes, moving about the deck in the darkest hour before dawn. It is tall and thin, dressed all in black, and when it moves it makes no sound at all. But, Captain, the most terrible thing is its eyes. They burn like coals in the darkness, and when it looked at me I felt as though it were looking straight into my soul." Captain Petrovich listened to his first mate's report with growing unease. Kirilenko was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural fears, and if he said he had seen something, then something had indeed been seen. But what that something might be, and how it had come to be aboard the Demeter, remained a mystery that defied rational explanation. The captain decided to keep watch himself that night, stationing himself on deck with a loaded pistol and a lamp, determined to solve the mystery of what was happening to his ship and his crew. For hours he waited in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship cutting through the waves and watching for any sign of the mysterious figure his first mate had described. It was just before dawn when Captain Petrovich finally encountered the thing that had been stalking his ship. A tall figure in black emerged from the direction of the cargo hold, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the rolling motion of the deck beneath its feet. The figure's face was pale as death in the lamplight, and its eyes did indeed burn with an inner fire that spoke of hungers and appetites no mortal man should possess. The captain raised his pistol and called out a challenge, but the figure merely smiled, revealing teeth that were sharp and pointed like those of a wolf. Then, with movements too quick for the human eye to follow, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows as though it had never been there at all. Captain Petrovich was left standing alone on the deck, his pistol pointing at empty air and his heart pounding with a fear unlike anything he had ever experienced in 30 years at sea. From that night forward, the disappearances accelerated. Each morning brought the discovery that another crew member had vanished during the night, leaving behind only his clothes and equipment as evidence that he had ever existed. The remaining sailors huddled together during their off-duty hours, no man willing to be alone even for a moment, and all of them speaking in whispers of the curse that had fallen upon their ship. Captain Petrovich continued to make entries in the ship's log, documenting each disappearance and recording his growing conviction that something supernatural had taken residence aboard the Demeter. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, became increasingly erratic as the strain of command under such circumstances began to tell upon his nerves. His entries spoke of sounds in the night that had no earthly source, of shadows that moved independently of any object that might cast them, and of an atmosphere of evil that grew stronger with each passing day. By the time the English coast came into sight, only Captain Petrovich and one other crew member remained alive. The last sailor, a young man named Pavel who had been with the ship for less than a year, was found on the morning they sighted Whitby Harbor, his body drained of blood and his face frozen in an expression of terminal terror. Captain Petrovich was now entirely alone with whatever creature had systematically destroyed his crew during the voyage from the Black Sea. The final entries in the Demeter's log tell a story of growing desperation and approaching madness. Captain Petrovich wrote of his intention to lash himself to the ship's wheel to prevent the creature from taking control of his vessel. He spoke of his determination to ensure that the Demeter would reach port even if he did not survive to see it, and of his hope that someone would find his log and understand what had befallen his ship and crew. The last entry, written in a hand that trembled with exhaustion and terror, simply read, "It is here, I can hear it moving below. The Lord preserve my soul, for I fear my body is lost. I go now to face whatever fate awaits me, but I will not let it take my ship. Whitby will be warned." The Demeter was discovered the next morning, driven ashore by the fierce storm that had battered the Yorkshire coast during the night. The ship was a wreck, her masts broken, and her hull split upon the rocks, but she had achieved her captain's final purpose. She had reached Whitby Harbor. Captain Petrovich was found lashed to the wheel, exactly as he had intended, a crucifix clutched in his dead hands, and an expression of grim determination on his frozen features. The cargo hold was found to be empty except for one box of earth that had been broken open, its contents scattered by the storm. Of the mysterious passenger who had chartered space aboard the Demeter, there was no sign, except for the witnesses who reported seeing a great black dog leap from the wreck as it struck the shore, a creature that vanished into the night and was never seen again in its canine form. The authorities conducted a thorough investigation into the loss of the Demeter and her crew, but could find no rational explanation for what had occurred during the voyage. The ship's log was preserved as evidence, though most who read it dismissed Captain Petrovich's final entries as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and responsibility. The few who took the account seriously were dismissed as superstitious fools who gave credence to old wives' tales and sailors' yarns. But Count Dracula had successfully completed the first phase of his invasion of England. He was now on British soil, with 49 boxes of Transylvanian earth strategically placed in locations throughout London and the surrounding countryside. The ancient vampire was free to begin his hunt among the unsuspecting population of the world's greatest city, and the centuries of planning and preparation were about to bear their terrible fruit. Chapter 5. The Prey of Whitby. In the charming seaside town of Whitby, far removed from the supernatural horrors that had befallen the crew of the Demeter, two young women were enjoying what they believed would be a peaceful and restorative holiday. Mina Murray, a schoolteacher of 24 with a keen intelligence and an indomitable spirit, had brought her dearest friend Lucy Westenra to the Yorkshire coast in hopes that the sea air would improve Lucy's health and spirits. Lucy Westenra was everything that Victorian society considered the ideal of young womanhood. At 20, she possessed a beauty that turned heads wherever she went, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like spun silk, eyes as blue as the summer sky, and a complexion that was the envy of every woman who knew her. But beyond her physical attractions, Lucy had a sweetness of character and a genuine kindness that endeared her to everyone she met. She was the sort of young woman who collected devoted admirers as naturally as flowers collect morning dew, and her recent engagement to the Honourable Arthur Holmwood had been celebrated as the perfect match between two of England's finest families. Mina, by contrast, was possessed of a more serious and practical nature. While she could not match Lucy's spectacular beauty, she had an intelligent face that spoke of depth of character and strength of will. Her dark hair was always neatly arranged, her clothing was sensible rather than fashionable, and her manner suggested a woman who was accustomed to taking responsibility and making difficult decisions. As a teacher in one of London's charitable schools, she had developed both the patience to deal with difficult situations and the organizational skills that would prove invaluable in the dark days that lay ahead. The two young women had been friends since childhood, their different temperaments complementing each other perfectly. Lucy provided the gaiety and lightness that kept Mina from becoming too serious, while Mina's steady good sense helped to anchor Lucy's more impulsive nature. Their correspondence over the years had been voluminous, filled with the sort of intimate details and mutual confidences that only the deepest friendship can sustain. Mina had suggested the trip to Whitby partly from concern for Lucy's health, which had seemed somewhat fragile in recent months, and partly from her own need for a respite from the worries that had been plaguing her about Jonathan Harker. Her fiancé's letters from Transylvania had become increasingly infrequent and troubling in their content, and his latest communications had ceased entirely, leaving Mina to imagine all sorts of terrible fates that might have befallen him in that distant and uncivilized land. Whitby, in the summer of 1893, was at the height of its popularity as a resort destination for the middle classes. The town's dramatic setting, with its ancient abbey ruins perched high on the cliff overlooking the harbor, its narrow streets climbing steeply from the waterfront, and its long stretches of sandy beach, made it an ideal retreat for city dwellers seeking the restorative powers of sea air and ocean views. The accommodations were comfortable without being luxurious, the society was respectable without being overly formal, and the pace of life was slow enough to allow visitors to truly relax and recover from the stresses of urban existence. Mina and Lucy had taken rooms in a pleasant boarding house run by a motherly woman named Mrs. Westenra, no relation to Lucy despite the shared surname, who took a genuine interest in the welfare of her guests and prided herself on maintaining standards of comfort and respectability that would satisfy the most demanding visitor. Their rooms overlooked the harbor, providing a constant view of the comings and goings of the fishing fleet and the occasional cargo vessel that brought goods from foreign ports. For the first weeks of their stay, both young women found exactly what they had hoped for in Whitby. Lucy's color improved markedly in the sea air, her appetite returned, and she regained much of the vivacity that had made her such a popular figure in London society. She delighted in the simple pleasures of seaside life, long walks along the beach, excursions to the ruins of Whitby Abbey, and afternoon teas in the town's quaint tea shops where she could observe the local characters and listen to their stories of maritime adventure and supernatural folklore. Mina, meanwhile, found solace in the town's literary associations and historical significance. She spent hours exploring the churchyard of St. Mary's, where the weathered headstones told the stories of generations of sailors and their families, and climbing the 199 steps that led from the town to the abbey ruins. The exercise and the intellectual stimulation of discovering new places and new stories helped to distract her from her worries about Jonathan, though she continued to watch anxiously for letters that never came. The two friends established a comfortable routine during their stay in Whitby. They would rise early to take advantage of the morning light for their walks, spend the midday hours reading or writing letters in the shade of their boarding house's garden, and devote the evenings to social activities or quiet conversation. Lucy, with her natural sociability, quickly made friends among the other visitors and the local residents, while Mina preferred to observe and record her impressions in the detailed journal she had maintained since girlhood. It was during their third week in Whitby that the first signs of trouble began to manifest themselves. Though at the time neither young woman recognized them as anything more than minor peculiarities that added interest to their holiday routine. Lucy began to experience difficulty sleeping, complaining of strange dreams that she could never quite remember upon waking but that left her feeling restless and disturbed. She developed a tendency to walk in her sleep, something that had never troubled her before, and Mina often found herself having to guide her friend back to bed after discovering her standing at the window or even wandering through the boarding house's corridors in her nightgown. These episodes were initially attributed to the change of environment and the excitement of being in a new place. But as they continued and intensified, Mina began to feel genuine concern for her friend's well-being. Lucy's sleepwalking became more frequent and more elaborate, with episodes that carried her farther from her room and into increasingly dangerous situations. On several occasions, Mina found her friend on the verge of leaving the boarding house entirely, dressed only in her nightclothes and apparently unconscious of her actions. The most alarming incident occurred during the night of August the 8th, when Mina awoke to find Lucy's bed empty and the window of their room standing wide open. A frantic search of the boarding house and its immediate surroundings revealed no trace of her missing friend, and Mina was forced to venture out into the dark streets of Whitby to continue her search. She had no idea how long Lucy had been gone, or in which direction she might have wandered. And the thought of her friend walking alone through the town in her vulnerable state filled Mina with a terror that she had never experienced before. Guided by instinct rather than logic, Mina made her way toward the old churchyard of St. Mary's, where she and Lucy had spent so many pleasant hours during their daylight explorations. The climb up the 199 steps was treacherous in the darkness, with only the faint light of the stars to guide her way. But something drew her inexorably toward the ancient burial ground that overlooked the harbor. As she reached the top of the cliff and entered the churchyard, Mina saw a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On one of the stone benches that provided resting places for visitors to the cemetery, she could make out the white figure of her friend, apparently unconscious or deeply asleep. But Lucy was not alone. Bending over her recumbent form was a tall, dark figure, and in the dim starlight, Mina could see that this stranger was positioned in such a way as to suggest an intimacy that was both inappropriate and deeply disturbing. Mina called out Lucy's name and began running toward the bench, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and outrage. As she approached, the dark figure straightened and turned toward her, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of a face that was pale as death and eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Then, with movements too quick for her to follow clearly, the figure melted away into the shadows among the gravestones, leaving behind only the impression of something that was not entirely human. Lucy remained unconscious during Mina's approach, and when her friend finally succeeded in rousing her, the young woman seemed completely unaware of where she was or how she had come to be there. She complained of feeling cold and weak, and Mina noticed with alarm that there were 2 small wounds on Lucy's throat, barely visible but surrounded by a slight redness that suggested they were fresh. When questioned about these marks, Lucy touched her throat with a puzzled expression and suggested that she might have scratched herself with a safety pin while dressing for bed. Mina helped her friend back to their boarding house, supporting Lucy's weight as they carefully descended the steep steps to the town below. Lucy seemed to grow stronger as they walked, but she remained confused about the evening's events and could offer no explanation for how she had come to be in the churchyard or who the mysterious figure might have been. She dismissed Mina's concerns about the stranger as a product of shadows and imagination, suggesting that what her friend had taken for a man was probably nothing more than a trick of moonlight on one of the cemetery's larger monuments. But Mina was not so easily convinced. The figure she had seen bending over Lucy had been unmistakably human in form, and there had been something in its posture and behavior that suggested intentions that were far from benevolent. The wounds on Lucy's throat, though minor, were too regular and precise to have been caused by accident, and their position suggested that they had been inflicted deliberately by someone or something with knowledge of human anatomy. From that night forward, Mina instituted a regime of vigilance that would have seemed excessive under normal circumstances, but which she felt was absolutely necessary given the strange events that had occurred. She made sure that the windows of their room were securely fastened each night, checked repeatedly to ensure that Lucy was safely in her bed, and even went so far as to tie a string around her friend's wrist that would alert her if Lucy attempted to leave the room during the night. Despite these precautions, Lucy's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew her as well as Mina did. The improvement in her health that had been so marked during the early weeks of their stay in Whitby began to reverse itself, and she gradually returned to the pallor and languor that had characterized her condition before their departure from London. Her appetite diminished, her energy flagged, and she began to complain of a persistent tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed able to cure. Most disturbing of all, the small wounds on Lucy's throat, rather than healing as such minor injuries should, seemed to become more pronounced with each passing day. They never showed signs of infection or inflammation, but neither did they close and disappear as normal cuts would have done. Instead, they remained as two small, neat punctures that looked as though they had been made by something sharp and pointed, and they had a tendency to bleed slightly during the night, staining Lucy's nightgowns with small spots of crimson that she could never adequately explain. Mina's written accounts of this period, preserved in the detailed journal she maintained throughout their stay in Whitby, provide a record of her growing alarm and her desperate attempts to understand what was happening to her friend. She consulted the local physician, Dr. Williams, who examined Lucy thoroughly but could find no medical explanation for her symptoms. He prescribed various tonics and recommended increased rest and nutrition, but acknowledged that Lucy's condition was unlike anything he had encountered in his 20 years of practice. The mystery deepened when Mina began to make inquiries among the local residents about the strange figure she had seen in the churchyard. Her descriptions of the tall, pale man in dark clothing struck a chord of recognition among some of the older inhabitants of Whitby, who spoke in hushed tones of local legends about creatures that walked the night and fed upon the blood of the living. These stories were dismissed by the more educated residents as mere superstition, but Mina noticed that even the skeptics seemed reluctant to venture out alone after dark, and that many of the local customs involved protective measures against supernatural threats. The arrival of the wrecked ship Demeter during the Great Storm of August the 9th added a new dimension to the atmosphere of unease that had settled over Whitby. The dramatic circumstances of the vessel's destruction, with its entire crew missing and its captain found dead at the wheel, provided the town with a subject of conversation that was both thrilling and disturbing. The official investigation into the tragedy yielded no satisfactory explanations, and the gaps in the ship's log only added to the mystery surrounding the vessel's final voyage. What particularly caught Mina's attention was the report of witnesses who claimed to have seen a large black dog leap from the wreck as it struck the shore. This detail, which most observers dismissed as an irrelevant curiosity, seemed to her to have a possible connection to the strange events that had been troubling Lucy's stay in Whitby. She had heard similar descriptions of mysterious black dogs in the folklore accounts she had been collecting, and the timing of the creature's appearance coincided too closely with the intensification of Lucy's symptoms to be merely coincidental. As August drew to a close, and the time approached for their return to London, Mina found herself faced with a terrible dilemma. Lucy's condition had continued to worsen despite all her efforts to protect and care for her friend, and she feared that whatever malevolent influence had been affecting Lucy and Whitby might follow them back to the capital. At the same time, she was desperate to return to civilization and seek proper medical attention for Lucy's mysterious ailment, and she had received word that Jonathan had finally been found in a hospital in Budapest, alive but suffering from some form of nervous collapse that had left him temporarily unable to travel. The decision was ultimately made for her when Lucy suffered a particularly severe episode during their final week in Whitby. Mina found her friend unconscious in the churchyard for the second time, but on this occasion Lucy's condition was so alarming that immediate medical intervention seemed necessary. Dr. Williams was summoned and, after examining the patient, recommended that she be removed to London as quickly as possible for consultation with specialists who might be better equipped to treat her unusual symptoms. And so ended Mina and Lucy's holiday in Whitby, which had begun with such bright hopes for rest and restoration, but had instead exposed them to supernatural dangers that neither young woman could have imagined in her darkest nightmares. As their train carried them south toward London, Mina watched her friend's pale face and wondered what sort of evil had been unleashed upon the world. and whether the knowledge and resources of the great city would prove sufficient to combat a threat that seemed to belong more to the realm of legend than to the rational world of the late 19th century. Unknown to either young woman, their return to London was exactly what Count Dracula had been anticipating. The ancient vampire had established himself in his new hunting grounds and was prepared to continue the careful campaign of corruption and destruction that he had begun among the cliffs and churchyards of Whitby. Lucy Westenra had been marked as his first victim in England, and neither distance nor medical science would be sufficient to save her from the fate that had been planned for her since the night the Demeter had brought her predator to English shores. Chapter 6. The Illness of Lucy Westenra. The return to London marked the beginning of the most harrowing period in the young life of Lucy Westenra, though neither she nor those who cared for her understood the true nature of the threat that had followed them from the wind-swept cliffs of Whitby to the gaslit streets of the world's greatest city. What had begun as a mysterious weakness during their seaside holiday now manifested itself as a serious illness that baffled the most distinguished physicians of the medical establishment and drove Lucy's friends and family to the brink of despair. Lucy's mother, Mrs. Sarah Westenra, was a woman of middle years whose own delicate health had been further compromised by years of worry about her daughter's welfare. She was the widow of a respected merchant who had left his family comfortably provided for but not wealthy, and Lucy's engagement to Arthur Holmwood represented not only a love match but also the security that comes from alliance with one of England's noble families. Miss Westenra had welcomed the match with gratitude and relief, seeing in it the promise that her beloved daughter would be cared for and protected throughout her life. But now that protection seemed powerless against the mysterious malady that was slowly but steadily draining the life from Lucy's young body. The girl who had left London full of health and vitality returned as a shadow of her former self, pale and listless, complaining of constant fatigue and a strange reluctance to venture out during the daylight hours. Her appetite had virtually disappeared, her sleep was troubled by dreams she could never quite remember, and her previously bright spirits had given way to a melancholy that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Arthur Holmwood, now Lord Godalming following the recent death of his father, was beside himself with anxiety about his fiancée's condition. A man of action accustomed to solving problems through the application of will and resources, he found himself helpless in the face of an enemy he could neither identify nor combat. He summoned the finest physicians in London, spared no expense in securing the most advanced medical treatments available, and devoted himself entirely to Lucy's care with a devotion that was both touching and heartbreaking to observe. Among the medical men consulted was Dr. John Seward, a young alienist who had recently taken charge of a private asylum in Purfleet, not far from London. Dr. Seward was a brilliant physician who had made significant contributions to the understanding of mental disorders, but his interest in Lucy's case was not entirely professional. He had been one of her unsuccessful suitors, and though he had accepted her engagement to Arthur with the grace of a gentleman, his feelings for her remained unchanged. When Arthur asked for his help in treating Lucy's mysterious illness, Seward put aside his personal disappointment and applied himself to the case with all the skill and dedication at his command. Dr. Seward's initial examination of Lucy revealed symptoms that were as puzzling as they were alarming. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her temperature remained consistently below normal, and her complexion had taken on a waxy pallor that spoke of severe anemia. Most disturbing of all were the 2 small wounds on her throat, which had first appeared during her stay in Whitby and which showed no signs of healing despite the application of various treatments. These puncture marks remained fresh and clean, as though they were being renewed on a regular basis, though no one could explain how such a thing might be occurring. The blood tests that Dr. Seward ordered revealed a condition that defied medical explanation. Lucy's blood count was dangerously low, as though she were suffering from severe hemorrhaging, yet no source of bleeding could be identified. Her red blood cell count continued to drop despite all efforts to improve her nutrition and general health, and her body seemed unable to replace the blood that was somehow being lost. The laboratory findings suggested a patient who should have been on the verge of death, yet Lucy remained conscious and alert, though increasingly weak and listless. As weeks passed and Lucy's condition continued to deteriorate, Dr. Seward found himself forced to admit that the case was beyond his expertise. In desperation, he wrote to his former teacher and mentor, Professor Abraham van Helsing of Amsterdam, whose unconventional methods and vast knowledge of obscure medical conditions had earned him a reputation as one of Europe's most brilliant physicians. Van Helsing's response to Seward's detailed description of Lucy's symptoms was immediate and urgent. He would travel to London at once to examine the patient and assist in her treatment. Professor Van Helsing was a man in his 60s, with a vigorous constitution that belied his years and an intellect that encompassed not only the latest advances in medical science, but also a deep knowledge of folklore, mythology, and the supernatural traditions of many cultures. His approach to medicine was holistic and unconventional, incorporating elements that more conservative physicians would have dismissed as superstition or quackery. But his results spoke for themselves, and even his most skeptical colleagues were forced to acknowledge his remarkable success in treating cases that had baffled everyone else. Van Helsing's first examination of Lucy took place in the presence of Dr. Seward and Arthur Holmwood, both of whom watched anxiously as the distinguished professor conducted his assessment. Van Helsing was thorough and methodical, examining not only Lucy's physical symptoms, but also questioning her closely about her dreams, her sleep patterns, and any unusual experiences she might have had in recent months. His questions about Whitby and the circumstances surrounding the mysterious incidents there seemed particularly significant, though he offered no immediate explanation for his interest in these details. After completing his examination, Van Helsing requested a private consultation with Dr. Seward, during which he revealed his initial assessment of Lucy's condition. What he had to say was so extraordinary that Seward initially questioned whether his old mentor might be suffering from some form of mental breakdown brought on by years of dealing with the most difficult and unusual cases in European medicine. "My dear John," Van Helsing said, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by an expression of grave concern, "what we are dealing with here is not a disease in any conventional sense. The symptoms you have described, the physical evidence I have observed, and the circumstances surrounding the onset of Miss Westenra's condition all point to a diagnosis that your medical training has not prepared you to accept. But I must ask you to trust in my experience and to follow my instructions precisely, for the young lady's life depends upon our ability to act quickly and decisively." Van Helsing's treatment regimen was unlike anything Dr. Seward had encountered in his medical career. Rather than prescribing conventional medicines, the professor insisted on surrounding Lucy's room with garlands of garlic flowers, placing crucifixes at strategic points around her bed, and ensuring that her windows were sealed with a paste made from crumbled communion wafers. These measures seemed more appropriate to a medieval monastery than a modern sickroom, but Van Helsing insisted on them with such authority that even the skeptical Dr. Seward felt compelled to comply. The effect of these unconventional treatments was immediate and dramatic. On the first night that Van Helsing's protective measures were in place, Lucy slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and when she awoke the next morning, she showed marked improvement in both color and energy. Her appetite returned, her spirits lifted, and for a brief period it seemed as though the mysterious illness had been conquered by the professor's strange but effective methods. But the improvement was short-lived. Mrs. Westenra, disturbed by the unusual smell of the garlic and the presence of religious symbols in her daughter's room, removed what she considered to be unsanitary and inappropriate decorations while Van Helsing was absent from the house. That night, Lucy suffered a severe relapse that brought her closer to death than she had ever been before, and only emergency measures by Van Helsing and Dr. Seward managed to save her life. The professor was devastated by this setback, realizing that his careful preparations had been undone by well-meaning but ignorant interference. He explained to Mrs. Westenra the critical importance of maintaining the protective measures exactly as he had prescribed them. But he could see in her eyes the skepticism and confusion of a rational person being asked to believe in things that contradicted everything she thought she knew about the world. From that point forward, Van Helsing insisted on maintaining a constant watch over Lucy, with either himself or Dr. Seward present in her room at all times. They took turns sitting by her bedside throughout the night, armed with garlic, crucifixes, and other protective talismans that Van Helsing had brought from Amsterdam. Their vigilance proved necessary, for on several occasions they observed phenomena that challenged their understanding of natural law. Strange shadows seemed to move independently around Lucy's room, despite the bright gaslighting that Van Helsing insisted on maintaining throughout the night. Sounds could be heard from outside her window that resembled the flapping of enormous wings, though no birds were ever seen during daylight investigations. Most disturbing of all, on more than one occasion both physicians observed what appeared to be a fine mist seeping through cracks in the window frame, a mist that seemed to have a life and purpose of its own. During these episodes, Lucy would become restless and agitated, tossing in her sleep and calling out in a voice that seemed somehow different from her own, deeper, more sensual, tinged with an accent that neither physician could identify. Her words were often unintelligible, spoken in what sounded like an ancient language, but the tone was unmistakably one of invitation and seduction, as though she were calling to someone or something in the darkness beyond her window. Van Helsing's response to these manifestations was swift and decisive. He would immediately reinforce the protective barriers around Lucy's bed, sprinkling holy water and pressing crucifix symbols against the windows and walls. The strange phenomena would gradually subside under this treatment, and Lucy would sink back into natural sleep, though she would wake the next morning with no memory of the night's disturbances. As Lucy's condition continued to fluctuate between improvement and relapse, Van Helsing made the difficult decision to bring Arthur Holmwood and Dr. Seward into his confidence about the true nature of what they were facing. What he had to tell them was so extraordinary that both men initially reacted with disbelief and skepticism, but the evidence of their own eyes and the professor's unshakable authority gradually convinced them that they were dealing with forces beyond the realm of conventional medicine. "Gentlemen," Van Helsing said during a private conference in Dr. Seward's study, "I must ask you to open your minds to possibilities that your scientific training has taught you to dismiss as superstition and folklore. What is attacking Miss Westenra is not a disease in any sense that your medical education would recognize. She is being systematically drained of her life force by a creature that belongs to the realm of the undead, what the common people call a vampire." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they believed about the rational, ordered world of the late 19th century. Arthur's first reaction was one of angry denial, demanding to know how a respected professor of medicine could give credence to medieval peasant superstitions. Dr. Seward, whose scientific background had taught him to rely on empirical evidence, found himself struggling to reconcile Van Helsing's diagnosis with everything he had learned about the nature of reality. But Van Helsing was patient and persistent, gradually presenting the evidence that had led him to his extraordinary conclusion. Lucy's symptoms, the progressive anemia, the mysterious wounds that would not heal, the aversion to daylight, the strange behavioral changes during sleep, all matched the classical descriptions of vampire attacks that could be found in the folklore of dozens of cultures. The protective measures that had proved effective, garlic, crucifixes, holy water, communion wafers, were the same remedies that had been used for centuries to ward off supernatural predators. Most convincing of all was Van Helsing's explanation of the vampire's methods and limitations. These creatures, he explained, could not enter a dwelling uninvited, which was why Lucy had been safe as long as the protective barriers remained in place. They were most active during the hours of darkness and had to return to their resting places before dawn. They possessed the ability to transform themselves into mist, wolves, bats, and other creatures, which explained the strange phenomena that had been observed around Lucy's room. "But how is such a thing possible?" Arthur demanded, his voice betraying the strain of trying to accept concepts that violated everything he thought he knew about the world. "How can dead men walk among the living? How can creatures of legend prey upon innocent people in the heart of modern London?" Van Helsing's response was both scholarly and deeply disturbing. He spoke of ancient bloodlines that had been corrupted by contact with supernatural forces, of humans who had been transformed into something other than human through rituals and practices that predated Christianity. These creatures, he explained, existed in a state between life and death, sustained by the blood of the living and possessed of powers that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional forms of attack. "The vampire is not merely a superstition, my friends," Van Helsing continued. "It is a reality that has plagued humanity since the dawn of recorded history. These creatures are intelligent, cunning, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit of victims. They are also patient beyond human comprehension, capable of planning campaigns of conquest that span decades or even centuries. What we are facing here is not a random attack by some mindless monster, but a carefully orchestrated assault by an ancient intelligence that has chosen Miss Westenra as its first victim in what may be a much larger campaign. The implications of Van Helsing's words gradually sank in as Arthur and Dr. Seward began to understand the full scope of the threat they were facing. If the professor was correct, then Lucy was merely the first target of a supernatural predator that had somehow established itself in London and was preparing to expand its hunting activities throughout the city. The safety of every citizen was potentially at risk, and the normal resources of law enforcement and medicine would be utterly inadequate to deal with such a threat. Van Helsing outlined the measures that would be necessary to save Lucy's life and eliminate the vampire threat. First, they would need to track down the creature's resting place and destroy it during the daylight hours when it was most vulnerable. This would require extensive research and investigation, as vampires typically established multiple lairs throughout their hunting territory and were careful to conceal their locations from potential enemies. Second, they would need to maintain constant vigilance over Lucy, ensuring that the protective barriers around her remained intact and that she was never left alone during the hours of darkness. The vampire would undoubtedly attempt to complete its conquest of its chosen victim, and any lapse in their defenses could prove fatal. Finally, they would need to prepare themselves for the possibility that their efforts might come too late to save Lucy in her human form. If the vampire succeeded in completing its corruption of her, she would herself become one of the undead, and they would face the terrible necessity of destroying the woman they loved in order to save her soul and protect others from the fate that had befallen her. The weight of this knowledge settled upon Arthur and Dr. Seward like a crushing burden. Both men had devoted themselves to protecting Lucy, but now they understood that their enemy was something against which conventional protection was useless. They were being asked to believe in the existence of supernatural evil and to prepare themselves for actions that went against every instinct of civilized behavior. But Van Helsing's authority and the evidence of their own observations gradually convinced them that they had no choice but to accept the professor's diagnosis and follow his guidance, no matter how extraordinary his methods might seem. The alternative, allowing Lucy to fall victim to a fate worse than death, was unthinkable for men who loved her. As if to underscore the urgency of their situation, Lucy suffered another severe crisis that same night. Despite all their protective measures, she lapsed into a coma so deep that for several hours her pulse could barely be detected and her breathing became almost imperceptible. Van Helsing worked frantically to save her, administering stimulants and employing techniques that seemed to draw as much from mystical traditions as from medical science. When Lucy finally regained consciousness, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in her condition. Her weakness was more pronounced than ever before, but there was also something different in her manner, a subtle alteration in her voice, her expressions, and her behavior that suggested influences that had nothing to do with ordinary illness. She spoke of strange dreams and visions, of flying through the night air and of tastes and sensations that she could not adequately describe but that clearly fascinated and attracted her. Most disturbing of all, Lucy began to exhibit an aversion to the protective symbols that Van Helsing had placed around her room. The crucifix that she had previously worn without complaint now seemed to cause her actual physical discomfort, and the garlic flowers that had once helped her sleep peacefully now filled her with inexplicable anxiety and revulsion. When Van Helsing attempted to place a communion wafer on her forehead as a test of her condition, it left a red mark on her skin as though it had burned her. These developments confirmed Van Helsing's worst fears about the progress of Lucy's transformation. The vampire's influence over her was growing stronger with each feeding, and soon she would pass beyond the point where human intervention could save her. The professor estimated that they had perhaps a week, possibly less, before Lucy would complete her transformation from victim to predator. And during that time they would need to locate and destroy her supernatural tormentor. The search for the vampire's lair began immediately, with Arthur using his social connections to gather information about recent property transactions in the London area, while Dr. Seward consulted his professional contacts among physicians and asylum administrators who might have encountered unusual cases or phenomena. Van Helsing, meanwhile, began a systematic study of shipping records and immigration documents, looking for evidence of the vampire's arrival in England and the transportation of the materials it would need to establish its resting places. Their investigations gradually began to bear fruit. Arthur's inquiries revealed that a mysterious foreign nobleman had recently purchased several properties in and around London, including an estate called Carfax that was located uncomfortably close to Dr. Seward's asylum. The buyer had paid in gold and had insisted on taking immediate possession of the properties, though neighbors reported that no signs of normal habitation had been observed at any of the locations. Dr. Seward's research uncovered several cases of unexplained illness among patients and staff at various London hospitals, all involving symptoms similar to those exhibited by Lucy. Most telling of all, Van Helsing's examination of shipping records revealed the arrival of the Demeter from Varna, with its cargo of 50 mysterious boxes and its crew's tragic fate during the voyage. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the three men realized that they were facing a threat of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The vampire had not simply wandered into London by chance. It had planned its invasion with military precision, establishing multiple strongholds throughout the city and beginning a systematic campaign to build an army of the undead from among London's population. But even as their understanding of the threat grew clearer, Lucy's condition continued to deteriorate. Each night brought her closer to the final transformation that would place her forever beyond their reach, and each dawn found her weaker and more changed than she had been the day before. Time was running out, and their enemy remained as elusive and dangerous as ever. The crisis came suddenly and without warning during what proved to be Lucy's final night as a human being. Despite all of Van Helsing's protective measures and the constant vigilance of her guardians, the vampire succeeded in penetrating their defenses through means that none of them had anticipated. When morning came and they checked on Lucy's condition, they found her lying unconscious in her bed, her face peaceful but deathly pale, and the telltale wounds on her throat deeper and more pronounced than they had ever been before. Van Helsing's examination confirmed what they had all feared. Lucy had passed beyond the point where conventional treatment could save her. The transformation was nearly complete, and within hours she would rise again as one of the undead, a creature of supernatural evil that would prey upon the innocent as she herself had been preyed upon. Chapter 7. The Transformation of Lucy. The death of Lucy Westenra came on a September morning, when the autumn mist hung low over London and the gas lamps still flickered in the gray dawn light. She passed away peacefully, surrounded by those who loved her most dearly. Arthur Holmwood, who had never left her side during the final vigil. Dr. Seward, whose medical expertise had proved helpless against the supernatural forces that claimed her, and Professor Van Helsing, whose vast knowledge had arrived too late to save the young woman whose life had been sacrificed to an ancient evil. In her final moments, Lucy seemed to return to her natural self, the sweetness and purity of her character, briefly reasserting itself over the darker influences that had been growing stronger within her day by day. She spoke lovingly to Arthur, expressing her gratitude for his devotion and her regret that their life together would never be. She thanked Dr. Seward for his care and asked him to remember her as she had been before the shadow fell upon her life. To Van Helsing, she whispered words of understanding and forgiveness, showing that even in her extremity she recognized that he had done everything in his power to save her. But even as Lucy drew her last breath, Van Helsing watched her face with an expression of grim concern that seemed inappropriate to the solemnity of the moment. The professor had seen death in many forms during his long career, but he knew that for Lucy Westenra, death would not bring the peace and rest that it offered to ordinary mortals. The vampire's corruption of her blood and soul meant that her physical death was merely the prelude to a more terrible transformation that would begin as soon as the sun set on this day of mourning. Arthur was devastated by the loss of his beloved fiancée, but his grief was the clean, honest sorrow of a man who had lost someone precious to natural death. He did not understand, as Van Helsing did, that Lucy's true ordeal was only beginning. Dr. Seward, whose scientific training had been shaken by recent events but whose fundamental worldview remained rooted in rational materialism, was similarly unprepared for what the professor knew must come next. The funeral arrangements proceeded according to the customs of Victorian society, with Lucy's body prepared for burial and placed in a beautiful coffin surrounded by flowers from friends and admirers throughout London. Her mother, already weakened by grief and poor health, was so overcome by the loss of her daughter that she took to her bed and never rose again, following Lucy to the grave within a matter of days. The double tragedy struck Arthur with overwhelming force, as he found himself responsible not only for mourning his lost love, but also for supporting Mrs. Westenra's family through their bereavement. Van Helsing observed these conventional responses to death with growing anxiety, knowing that he would soon be forced to reveal truths that would challenge everything Arthur and Dr. Seward believed about the nature of life, death, and the possibility of existence beyond the grave. The professor had faced similar situations before in his long career, but never had the stakes been so high or the personal cost so devastating for those involved. Lucy was laid to rest in a beautiful tomb in Hampstead Cemetery, a location that Van Helsing noted with particular interest for reasons he did not yet share with his companions. The cemetery was old and sprawling, with many secluded areas where the activities of the undead might go unobserved by casual visitors. More significantly, it was located in a part of London where young children often played, and Van Helsing knew from his studies of vampire folklore that the newly transformed undead often developed in particular hunger for the blood of the innocent. For several days after the funeral, life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy for the bereaved men. Arthur threw himself into settling the affairs of the Westenra family, while Dr. Seward returned to his duties at the asylum, though both men moved through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their thoughts constantly returning to the woman they had lost. Van Helsing remained in London, ostensibly to provide comfort and support to his grieving friends, but actually to monitor the situation and prepare for the confrontation he knew was coming. The first signs that Lucy's death had not ended the supernatural threat came in the form of newspaper reports about missing children in the Hampstead area. The stories were initially dismissed as routine incidents of the type that unfortunately occurred all too frequently in a city the size of London, but Van Helsing noticed details that suggested a more sinister pattern. The children who disappeared were all very young, typically between the ages of 3 and 7, and they were found several days later in a confused and weakened condition, with no clear memory of where they had been or what had happened to them. More significantly, all of the recovered children bore small wounds on their throats, wounds that the attending physicians attributed to scratches from brambles or other natural causes, but which Van Helsing recognized as having a far more ominous significance. The children spoke in their delirium of a beautiful lady who had called to them from the shadows of the cemetery, promising them sweets and games if they would come away with her. This lady, they said, had been very pale and dressed in white, and her voice had been so lovely that they had been unable to resist following her into the darkness. Van Helsing shared his suspicions with Dr. Seward, but held back from approaching Arthur with the terrible truth until he had gathered more definitive evidence. The young lord was still deep in grief and struggling to rebuild his life after the devastating losses he had suffered, and Van Helsing was reluctant to add to his burden unless absolutely necessary. Dr. Seward, meanwhile, found himself torn between his scientific skepticism and his growing trust in Van Helsing's extraordinary expertise. The proof that Van Helsing had been waiting for came on a foggy October evening when he and Dr. Seward decided to maintain a vigil in Hampstead Cemetery, hoping to observe whatever might be preying upon the local children. They concealed themselves among the larger monuments and waited through the long hours of the night, armed with crucifixes, holy water, and other protective talismans that Van Helsing insisted were essential for their safety. Just before dawn, when the mist was thickest and the darkness most profound, they saw a white figure moving gracefully among the gravestones. Even at a distance, the figure was unmistakably feminine, tall and slender, with long hair that seemed to float around her like a veil. She moved with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic to watch, and when she turned toward their hiding place, both men could see that her face was beautiful beyond description. But it was a beauty that was cold and terrible, like that of a marble statue animated by some malevolent force. The figure was carrying something in her arms, a small bundle that moved and whimpered with the voice of a frightened child. As she approached Lucy's tomb, Dr. Seward could see with growing horror that the beautiful woman was indeed their beloved Lucy, but transformed into something that retained her physical appearance while possessing none of her former sweetness and humanity. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her eyes burned with an unholy fire, and her lips were stained with what could only be fresh blood. Van Helsing restrained Dr. Seward when the younger man started to rise from their hiding place, knowing that a direct confrontation with the vampire in her current state would be both dangerous and futile. Instead, they watched in fascinated horror as Lucy approached the entrance to her own tomb, which opened at her touch despite the heavy stone seals that should have made such access impossible. She disappeared into the darkness of the crypt, carrying her small victim with her, and the tomb sealed itself again as though she had never been there. When morning came and the cemetery groundskeepers arrived for their daily duties, they found a small child wandering near the entrance gates, confused and weakened but otherwise unharmed. The child spoke of the beautiful lady who had shown him wonderful games in a place that smelled of flowers and earth, but he could provide no useful details about where he had been or how he had come to be in the cemetery. Dr. Seward was now forced to confront the reality of what Lucy had become, and the knowledge nearly destroyed his sanity. To see the woman he had loved transformed into a predator that stalked innocent children challenged everything he believed about the nature of death and the possibility of redemption. Van Helsing, whose long experience with the supernatural had prepared him for such revelations, focused on the practical necessity of protecting the living from the threat that Lucy now represented. The professor explained to his shaken companion that Lucy was now a creature driven by supernatural hunger, compelled to feed upon the blood of the living in order to maintain her unholy existence. She had retained her human appearance and many of her memories, but her fundamental nature had been corrupted beyond any possibility of restoration. The sweet and innocent young woman they had known was gone forever, replaced by a predator whose beauty served only to lure victims within reach of her fangs. More disturbing still was Van Helsing's explanation of how vampirism spread from one victim to another. Each person killed by a vampire would eventually rise again as one of the undead, creating an ever-expanding population of supernatural predators. If Lucy were allowed to continue her hunting activities, the children she claimed as victims would themselves become vampires, and the contagion would spread throughout London with exponential speed. "We are facing not merely the loss of one dear friend," Van Helsing explained gravely, "but the potential destruction of everything we hold dear about human civilization. Lucy must be stopped, not out of hatred or revenge, but out of love, love for what she once was, and love for those she threatens to destroy." The task that lay before them was one that violated every instinct of civilized behavior and challenged every principle of Christian morality. They would have to track Lucy to her resting place during the daylight hours when she was most vulnerable, and then destroy her with methods that seemed more appropriate to medieval witch hunters than to educated gentlemen of the modern age. Van Helsing spoke of wooden stakes driven through the heart, of decapitation with consecrated blades, of the necessity of filling the vampire's mouth with garlic and holy wafers to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Dr. Seward's first reaction was one of horrified refusal, insisting that there must be some other way to save Lucy, or at least to contain the threat she represented, without resorting to such barbaric measures. But Van Helsing was implacable, explaining that centuries of experience had proven there was no middle course when dealing with the undead. Vampires could not be reasoned with, contained, or cured. They could only be destroyed, completely and permanently, or they would continue to spread their curse until entire populations had been corrupted. The professor's arguments were reinforced by the appearance of more missing children reports, each following the same pattern as the earlier incidents. The beautiful lady in white was becoming bolder in her hunting activities, and the number of potential victims was growing with each passing night. Local authorities were baffled by the rash of incidents, attributing them to organized crime or some form of mass hysteria. But Van Helsing knew that conventional law enforcement would be powerless against a supernatural predator. The decision to bring Arthur into their confidence was made when Van Helsing realized that they would need his help to gain access to Lucy's tomb during daylight hours. The cemetery authorities would not permit unauthorized intrusions into the burial grounds, but Arthur's status as Lucy's fiancé and his social connections might provide the necessary access. More importantly, Van Helsing believed that Arthur had a right to know the truth about what had befallen the woman he loved, regardless of how painful that truth might be. Arthur's reaction to Van Helsing's revelations was initially one of outraged disbelief, followed by a period of anguished denial as he struggled to accept the impossible. The idea that Lucy had not found peace in death but had instead been transformed into a creature of evil was almost more than he could bear. But as Van Helsing presented the evidence, the newspaper reports, the eyewitness accounts, and finally the testimony of Dr. Seward, who had seen Lucy's transformed state with his own eyes, Arthur was forced to confront the terrible reality of their situation. The young lord's grief was transformed into a fierce determination to do whatever was necessary to free Lucy's soul from its supernatural bondage and to protect other innocent victims from the fate that had befallen her. If this meant violating her grave and destroying her undead body, then he would find the strength to do what love demanded, no matter how much it cost him personally. Van Helsing outlined his plan for the confrontation with Lucy, explaining that they would need to approach her tomb during the daylight hours, when she would be trapped in her death-like sleep and unable to defend herself. The destruction of a vampire was not a simple matter of physical violence. It required specific rituals and materials that had been developed over centuries of warfare against the undead. They would need wooden stakes cut from ash trees and blessed by a priest, consecrated water from a church that had been continuously used for Christian worship for at least 500 years, and communion wafers that had been specially prepared for this unholy purpose. Most importantly, they would need the strength of will to carry out their grim task in the face of Lucy's supernatural beauty and the memories of what she had once been. Van Helsing warned them that vampires possessed powerful abilities to cloud men's minds and to appear as they had been in life, using every psychological weapon at their disposal to prevent their own destruction. They would need to steel themselves against pity, sentiment, and the natural reluctance to harm someone they had loved. As they made their final preparations for the confrontation with Lucy, all three men were haunted by the knowledge that this was merely the first battle in what would undoubtedly be a longer war. Somewhere in London, the ancient vampire that had created Lucy was continuing its own campaign of corruption and destruction, building an army of the undead and preparing for conquests that would make their current struggles seem insignificant by comparison. But before they could face that greater threat, they had to deal with the immediate danger that Lucy represented and find the courage to do what love and duty demanded of them. Chapter 8. The Destruction of the Vampire Lucy. The confrontation with what Lucy Westenra had become took place on a gray October morning, when the fog hung thick over Hampstead Cemetery and the ancient yew trees dripped with moisture that seemed to carry the chill of the grave itself. Van Helsing, Dr. Seward, and Arthur Holmwood approached Lucy's tomb with the solemnity of men who understood that they were about to commit an act that would violate every convention of civilized behavior, yet who had no choice but to proceed if they hoped to save innocent lives and free a tormented soul from supernatural bondage. The professor had spent the previous evening in careful preparation, gathering the materials and implements that would be necessary for their grim task. From his traveling case, he produced items that seemed more appropriate to a medieval exorcist than a modern physician. Wooden stakes carved from ash trees that had been blessed by 3 different priests, a hammer whose head had been forged from silver and consecrated with holy water, vials of water from the Jordan River, and communion wafers that had been prepared in a monastery where prayers had been offered continuously for over 800 years. Arthur carried the legal documents that would permit them access to the tomb, though Van Helsing doubted that any earthly authority would have sanctioned their true purpose had the full nature of their mission been known. Dr. Seward brought his medical bag, though the healing arts in which he had been trained would be of little use in the work that lay ahead. Each man also carried a crucifix and a supply of garlic, items that Van Helsing insisted were essential for their protection against the supernatural forces they were about to confront. The cemetery groundskeeper, a dour Scotsman named MacLeod, who had tended the graves of Hampstead for over 30 years, met them at the gates with obvious reluctance. He had been paid handsomely for his cooperation, but it was clear that he considered their mission to be both irregular and unseemly. Religious law and social custom dictated that the dead should be left to rest in peace, and MacLeod's Presbyterian sensibilities were offended by any suggestion that Lucy's grave should be disturbed for any reason. "I'll not be party to any desecration," MacLeod declared as he led them through the winding paths between the monuments. "Miss Westenra was a good Christian lass, and she deserves better than to have her rest disturbed by the whims of men who should know better. If you've some legal business with the grave, I'll witness it as the law requires, but I'll not stand by while you commit any unseemly acts." Van Helsing assured the groundskeeper that their intentions were entirely respectful and that they were acting in accordance with wishes that Lucy herself had expressed before her death. This was not entirely truthful, but the professor knew that MacLeod would never have cooperated had he understood the true nature of their mission. The preservation of innocent life sometimes required deceptions that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances, and Van Helsing had long ago made peace with the moral compromises that his work sometimes demanded. Lucy's tomb was a modest but elegant structure of white marble, topped with a sleeping angel whose face bore a disturbing resemblance to the young woman whose remains it was supposed to guard. Fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the monument, white roses and lilies that Arthur recognized as coming from the gardens of his own estate. The flowers were perfectly fresh despite having been placed there several days earlier, a detail that Van Helsing noted with grim satisfaction as confirmation of his theories about the supernatural preservative effects of vampiric corruption. The tomb's entrance was sealed with a heavy stone slab that should have required the efforts of several strong men to move, but when Arthur applied the key that the cemetery authorities had provided, the stone swung open as easily as an ordinary door. A wave of cold air flowed from the opening, carrying with it a scent that was neither of corruption nor of the embalming fluids that should have preserved Lucy's body, but rather of something that reminded all three men of underground places where no living thing had ever walked. Van Helsing lit a lantern and led the way into the tomb's interior, which was larger and more elaborate than its external appearance suggested. The walls were lined with niches that had obviously been designed to accommodate multiple burials over many generations, though Lucy's coffin was currently the only occupant of this underground chamber. The air was still and cold, with an oppressive quality that made breathing difficult and conversation almost impossible. Lucy's coffin rested on a stone bier in the center of the chamber, its polished wood gleaming in the lantern light and its brass fittings reflecting the flame like watching eyes. Van Helsing approached it slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, while Arthur and Dr. Seward hung back near the entrance, both men struggling with emotions that ranged from grief to horror to a terrible anticipation of what they were about to discover. The professor's examination of the coffin revealed that its lid was not properly secured, despite the fact that it had been sealed by the undertaker only days earlier. The brass screws that should have held it tightly closed were loose in their holes, and when Van Helsing pressed gently against the lid, it shifted slightly, as though whatever lay within had been moving and had disturbed the careful arrangements made for the burial. "Gentlemen," Van Helsing said quietly, "I must ask you to prepare yourselves for what we are about to see. Remember that what lies within this coffin is no longer the Lucy Westenra you knew and loved. That sweet lady has passed beyond our reach, and what remains is something that bears her appearance but possesses none of her virtue or humanity. Steel your hearts against sentiment, for mercy shown to this creature would be cruelty to its future victims." With careful movements, Van Helsing lifted the coffin lid and set it aside, revealing the interior and its occupant. What they saw there challenged their understanding of death and corruption in ways that no amount of preparation could have made tolerable. Lucy lay within the coffin exactly as she had been placed there by the undertaker, her burial dress arranged with careful precision and her hands folded peacefully over her breast. But instead of showing the natural effects of death and decay, her body appeared more beautiful and lifelike than it had been during her final illness. Her skin was pale but smooth and unblemished, with a translucent quality that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Her hair had grown longer and more lustrous than it had been in life, cascading around her shoulders in waves that seemed to move with their own inner life. Most shocking of all, her lips were full and red, stained with what could only be fresh blood, evidence of recent feeding that made her true nature unmistakably clear. Arthur staggered backward at the sight, his face contorting with grief and horror as he was forced to confront the reality of what his beloved had become. Dr. Seward was transfixed by the medical impossibility of what he was observing, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with everything he had been taught about the processes of death and decay. Van Helsing alone remained composed, having seen similar sights before and knowing that worse revelations were yet to come. As they watched in fascinated horror, Lucy's eyes slowly opened, revealing orbs that burned with an inner fire like coals from the depths of hell. Her gaze fixed on Arthur with an expression of recognition and hunger that was both familiar and utterly alien, and when she smiled, her lips drew back to reveal canine teeth that had grown long and pointed like those of a predatory animal. "Arthur, my love," she said, her voice carrying the same sweet tones that had once delighted him but now tinged with a seductive quality that spoke of appetites no decent woman should possess. "You have come to me at last. I have been so lonely in this cold place, waiting for you to join me in the darkness. Come closer, my darling, and let me show you the pleasures that await us both beyond the grave." Arthur took an involuntary step toward the coffin, his love for Lucy warring with his horror at what she had become. The vampire's beauty was enhanced, rather than diminished by her transformation, and her supernatural charisma made resistance almost impossible for someone who had loved her in life. Van Helsing quickly stepped between them, pressing a crucifix against Lucy's forehead and causing her to recoil with a hiss of pain and rage. "You see how she would tempt you," Van Helsing said grimly, maintaining his position between Arthur and the vampire despite Lucy's increasingly aggressive attempts to reach her former fiancé. "This is not love, but hunger, not affection, but predation. She would drain your blood and corrupt your soul, not from malice, but because that is now her nature. The Lucy you loved is gone, and what remains must be destroyed if others are to be saved from her fate." The vampire Lucy's attempts at seduction quickly gave way to fury as she realized that Van Helsing's protections were preventing her from reaching her intended victim. Her beautiful features contorted into an expression of rage and malevolence that revealed her true nature, and her voice changed from sweet persuasion to snarling threats that echoed strangely in the confines of the tomb. "You cannot keep him from me forever, old man," she hissed, her words carrying an accent that none of them could identify but that suggested origins far older than her English birth. "He belongs to me now, as I belong to my master. Death has made us both free from the petty constraints of mortal life, and soon he will understand the joy of hunting beneath the stars and feeding upon the warm blood of the innocent." Van Helsing responded by pressing the crucifix more firmly against her forehead, causing smoke to rise from her skin as though she were being burned by an invisible flame. Lucy writhed in agony but could not escape from the sacred symbol's power, her supernatural strength rendered useless by the spiritual forces that Van Helsing had brought to bear against her. "Now, Arthur," the professor commanded, "while she is restrained by the power of the cross, you must do what love demands. Take the stake and hammer, and strike true and hard. Think not of what she appears to be, but of what she truly is, a creature of evil that wears the face of the woman you loved, in order to corrupt and destroy the innocent." Arthur took the ashwood stake with hands that trembled like those of a man with palsy, his face white with the strain of what he was being asked to do. Every instinct screamed against the act of driving a wooden blade through the heart of the woman who had been the center of his world, even though his rational mind understood the necessity of the deed. The vampire Lucy watched his approach with eyes that alternated between pleading and predatory, using every weapon in her supernatural arsenal to prevent her own destruction. "Arthur, please," she whispered, her voice once again taking on the sweet tones that had enchanted him during their courtship. "Do not listen to this old fool, who fills your mind with superstitions and lies. I am still your Lucy, still the woman who promised to be your wife. Death has not changed my love for you. It has only made it stronger, more eternal than any mortal affection could ever be. Join me in this new existence, and we shall never be parted again." But Van Helsing's voice cut through her supernatural persuasion with the authority of absolute knowledge. "See how she lies, even now. The Lucy you loved would never ask you to damn your soul for her sake. This creature seeks only to corrupt you as she herself has been corrupted, to make you a partner in evil rather than a companion in virtue. Strike now, while her power is constrained, and free her soul from its supernatural prison." Arthur raised the stake above Lucy's heart, the point trembling as he struggled to find the courage to complete the act that love and duty demanded. The vampire beneath him seemed to sense his wavering resolve, and her pleas became more desperate and manipulative, alternating between promises of eternal bliss and threats of lonely damnation if he proceeded with his intended course. "Think of our children that might have been," she whispered, tears of blood streaming down her pale cheeks. "Think of the life we planned together, the happiness that was stolen from us by death and circumstance. This old man would rob us of our last chance for reunion, our final opportunity to find joy in each other's company. Do not let his fears and prejudices destroy what we can still salvage from the wreckage of our mortal dreams." Dr. Seward watched this terrible struggle between love and necessity with his own heart breaking, understanding that Arthur was being asked to perform an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of whether he completed it or not. The young lord was caught between his devotion to the woman he had loved and his responsibility to the innocent victims who would suffer if that woman's transformed state was allowed to continue unchecked. But Van Helsing remained implacable, knowing from experience that any hesitation or mercy shown to the undead would ultimately result in greater suffering for the living. "She speaks now with the voice of the creature that destroyed her," he said firmly. "Every word is calculated to weaken your resolve and preserve her unholy existence. Remember the children she has already corrupted, and think of those who will follow if you cannot find the strength to act." Finally, with a prayer to the god who had seemed so distant during these trials, Arthur brought the hammer down upon the stake with all the force he could muster. The ashwood point penetrated Lucy's heart with a sound like thunder in the confines of the tomb, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. The vampire's body convulsed as though struck by lightning, her back arching and her limbs thrashing with supernatural strength that gradually faded as her unholy life force drained away. But even more shocking than her physical reaction was the transformation that overtook her features as the stake did its work. The predatory beauty that had marked her vampiric state gradually faded, replaced by an expression of peace and gratitude that was unmistakably that of the Lucy they had known and loved in life. Her eyes, which had burned with unholy fire since her transformation, became soft and human once again, filled with recognition and love for the man who had just freed her from her supernatural bondage. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying all the sweetness and purity that had characterized her mortal existence. "Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. I can rest now, and the children will be safe. Remember me as I was, not as I became, and know that your courage has saved my soul from eternal damnation." With these words, Lucy's eyes closed for the final time, and her body began to show the natural effects of death that had been supernaturally postponed during her vampiric existence. The unnatural preservation that had kept her beautiful and lifelike gave way to the ordinary processes of decay, though even in death she retained a dignity and peace that spoke of a soul finally freed from corruption. Van Helsing completed the ritual destruction by removing Lucy's head with a consecrated blade and filling her mouth with garlic and holy wafers, ensuring that no supernatural force could ever again animate her remains. These final acts were performed with clinical efficiency, but also with the reverence due to someone who had been both victim and threat, both beloved friend and supernatural enemy. Arthur stood by throughout these final procedures, his face streaked with tears, but his expression showing a peace that had been absent since Lucy's first manifestation of her mysterious illness. The terrible deed was done, and though the cost to his own emotional well-being had been enormous, he knew that he had acted out of love rather than hatred, mercy rather than revenge. Dr. Seward documented the entire process in his professional journal, recording details that would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman by any colleague who might have read them. But he had seen with his own eyes the reality of supernatural evil and the effectiveness of the ancient remedies that Van Helsing had employed against it. His scientific worldview had been permanently altered by these experiences, though he was not yet ready to abandon entirely his faith in rational materialism. As they prepared to leave the tomb and return Lucy's remains to their final rest, Van Helsing took the opportunity to explain to his companions the larger implications of what they had just accomplished. Lucy's destruction was merely the first victory in what would undoubtedly be a longer and more dangerous campaign against the ancient vampire that had created her. "We have saved the innocent from one predator," the professor explained as they sealed the tomb and prepared to depart. "But the master who corrupted her remains at large somewhere in London. He will not take the loss of his creation lightly, and he will undoubtedly seek to replace her with other victims who can serve his purposes. Our work has only begun, and the greatest challenges still lie ahead." The professor's words proved prophetic, for even as they were conducting their grim business in Hampstead Cemetery, events were unfolding elsewhere in London that would draw them into direct confrontation with Count Dracula himself. The ancient vampire had been monitoring their activities through supernatural means, and he was already preparing his response to the destruction of his first English creation. But for the moment, Arthur, Dr. Seward, and Van Helsing could take satisfaction in knowing that they had successfully freed one tormented soul from supernatural bondage and protected an unknown number of innocent children from a fate worse than death. Lucy Westenra was finally at peace, and the vampire that had worn her face would never again prowl the streets of London in search of prey. The three men left Hampstead Cemetery as different people than they had been when they entered it. They had been forced to confront the reality of supernatural evil and to take actions that violated every convention of civilized behavior. but they had also discovered reserves of courage and determination that they had not known they possessed. The knowledge and experience they had gained would prove invaluable in the battles that lay ahead, though none of them could have imagined the scope and intensity of the conflict that was about to engulf them. Chapter 9. The Return of Jonathan Harker. While the tragic drama of Lucy Westenra's transformation and destruction was playing out in London, Jonathan Harker was struggling to rebuild his shattered life in a Budapest hospital, where he had been discovered by British consular officials in a state of complete physical and mental collapse. The ordeal of his escape from Castle Dracula had left him weak in body and broken in spirit, his memories of supernatural horror warring with his desperate desire to believe that the entire experience had been nothing more than an elaborate nightmare brought on by illness and isolation. The hospital where Jonathan was recovering was a modern institution staffed by physicians who prided themselves on their scientific approach to medicine and their rejection of the superstitious beliefs that still plagued the more backward regions of Eastern Europe. Dr. Heinrich Steiner, the German physician who had taken charge of Jonathan's case, was a rational materialist who attributed his patient's condition to a combination of nervous exhaustion, malnutrition, and what he termed a temporary derangement brought on by exposure to unfamiliar cultural practices. Dr. Steiner's diagnosis was not entirely incorrect, though it failed to account for the supernatural elements that had been the true cause of Jonathan's breakdown. The young solicitor had indeed suffered from malnutrition during his captivity in Castle Dracula, and his nervous system had been severely strained by the constant terror of his situation. But the unfamiliar cultural practices to which the doctor attributed his patient's delusional ravings were actually encounters with forces that existed far beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Jonathan's recovery was slow and uncertain, marked by periods of lucidity alternating with episodes of delirium during which he would relive the most terrifying moments of his captivity. He spoke repeatedly of walls that could be climbed like a lizard, of women with fangs and burning eyes, of boxes filled with cursed earth, and of a pale nobleman whose very touch was like ice from the grave. The hospital staff dismissed these accounts as fever dreams, but Dr. Steiner was troubled by the consistency and detail of his patient's delusions. What particularly concerned the physician was Jonathan's physical condition, which showed signs of trauma that could not be explained by ordinary illness or accident. There were marks on his throat that resembled wounds made by some sharp instrument, though they had healed cleanly and showed no signs of infection. His blood count was unusually low, as though he had suffered from significant blood loss, yet no source of hemorrhaging could be identified. Most puzzling of all, Jonathan showed an extreme aversion to mirrors and reflective surfaces, becoming agitated whenever he caught sight of his own image. The breakthrough in Jonathan's recovery came with the arrival of a letter from London, written in Mina Murray's familiar hand, and carrying news that was both wonderful and deeply disturbing. Mina had learned of his whereabouts through inquiries made by the British diplomatic service, and she was making immediate arrangements to travel to Budapest to assist in his care and bring him home to England. Her letter was filled with expressions of love and concern, but it also contained troubling references to recent events in London that seemed to echo the supernatural horrors Jonathan had experienced in Transylvania. Mina wrote of Lucy Westenra's mysterious illness and death, of strange incidents involving missing children, and of consultations with a foreign professor who possessed unusual expertise in rare medical conditions. She mentioned the involvement of Dr. Seward and Arthur Holmwood in these events, and hinted at discoveries that had challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of life and death. The letter was carefully worded to avoid alarming the hospital authorities who might read it, but Jonathan recognized in its subtext confirmation that the evil he had encountered in Castle Dracula had somehow followed him to England. The prospect of reunion with Mina provided Jonathan with the emotional strength he needed to focus on his recovery and begin the difficult process of distinguishing between genuine memories and trauma-induced hallucinations. Dr. Steiner had assured him repeatedly that his accounts of supernatural encounters were products of a mind temporarily unbalanced by physical and emotional stress, and Jonathan desperately wanted to believe this rational explanation. But the arrival of Mina's letter, with its suggestions that similar phenomena were manifesting themselves in London, forced him to confront the possibility that his experiences in Transylvania had been terrifyingly real. Mina's journey to Budapest was undertaken despite the strong objections of her family and friends, who considered it inappropriate for a young unmarried woman to travel alone through the volatile political landscape of Eastern Europe. But Mina was not a conventional Victorian lady who allowed social conventions to override practical necessities, and she was determined to reach Jonathan as quickly as possible regardless of the personal risks involved. Her strength of character and organizational abilities, which had already proven valuable in dealing with Lucy's crisis, would prove even more essential in the battles that lay ahead. The reunion between Jonathan and Mina took place in the hospital's garden on a crisp October morning, when the autumn sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended flower beds. Jonathan had been preparing for this moment for weeks, rehearsing the words he would use to explain his condition without revealing the supernatural elements that he still hoped might prove to be delusions. But when he saw Mina walking toward him, her face glowing with love and relief, he found himself unable to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Mina's first reaction was one of shock at the change in Jonathan's appearance. The confident young solicitor who had left London months earlier had been replaced by a pale, gaunt figure whose eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. His hair had gone prematurely gray during his ordeal, and his hands trembled with a nervous condition that Dr. Steiner attributed to prolonged stress, but which Mina suspected had deeper and more disturbing causes. But Mina's love for Jonathan transcended any concerns about his altered appearance or damaged health. She had come to Budapest not only as his fiancée, but as his partner in facing whatever challenges the future might bring, and she was prepared to accept whatever truth lay behind his mysterious illness. Her strength and practical intelligence had already been tested by the events surrounding Lucy's death, and she possessed the emotional resilience necessary to deal with revelations that would have shattered a more conventional woman. Jonathan's decision to share his experiences in Castle Dracula with Mina was not made lightly. Dr. Steiner had warned him repeatedly against dwelling on his delusions, insisting that recovery depended on his ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. But the references in Mina's letter to supernatural phenomena in London convinced Jonathan that his memories of Transylvania might be more than mere hallucinations, and he felt compelled to provide Mina with information that might prove relevant to whatever crisis was unfolding in their homeland. The account that Jonathan gave to Mina during their long walks through Budapest was detailed, coherent, and utterly fantastic. He spoke of Count Dracula's supernatural nature, of the vampire women who haunted the castle's ancient chambers, of nocturnal transformations that violated every law of physics and biology. He described the Count's preparations for invasion of England, the shipment of earthen boxes to London, and his own desperate escape from a fortress where the normal rules of reality seemed to have been suspended. Mina listened to these revelations with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence and reach logical conclusions. Her experience as a teacher had taught her to distinguish between genuine accounts and fabricated stories, and everything about Jonathan's manner suggested that he was describing real events rather than imaginary ones. More importantly, the details of his account matched too closely with the strange incidents surrounding Lucy's death to be mere coincidence. The decision to return immediately to London was made jointly, though both Jonathan and Mina understood that they were walking into a situation that might prove even more dangerous than the one Jonathan had escaped in Transylvania. Mina's letters from Dr. Seward had become increasingly urgent and cryptic, hinting at developments that required the immediate attention of anyone who possessed knowledge of supernatural threats. The references to Professor Van Helsing and his unconventional methods suggested that rational people were being forced to accept the reality of forces that science could not explain. Their journey from Budapest to London was undertaken with all possible speed, but it still required several days of travel through territories that were politically unstable and geographically challenging. Jonathan's health remained fragile, and the stress of travel often triggered episodes of anxiety and disorientation that reminded both of them how close he had come to complete mental breakdown. But Mina's presence provided him with the emotional anchor he needed to maintain his grip on sanity and purpose. During their journey, Mina shared with Jonathan the details of Lucy's illness and death, carefully omitting the most disturbing elements of Van Helsing's diagnosis and treatment. She spoke of mysterious symptoms that had baffled London's finest physicians, of protective measures that seemed more appropriate to medieval times than the modern age, and of a foreign professor whose knowledge encompassed areas that conventional medicine did not recognize. Jonathan listened to these accounts with growing alarm, recognizing in them confirmation of his worst fears about Count Dracula's successful establishment in England. The pattern that emerged from their combined knowledge was both clear and terrifying. Count Dracula had indeed invaded England, bringing with him the supernatural corruption that had turned his ancient castle into a place of horror and death. Lucy Westenra had been his first victim, chosen perhaps for her beauty and social position, or simply because she had been available when the vampire began his hunting activities. Her transformation and apparent death were merely the beginning of what promised to be a campaign of corruption that could ultimately threaten the entire population of London. As their train carried them across the European continent toward the English Channel, Jonathan and Mina began to develop the partnership that would prove essential in the battles ahead. Mina's organizational skills and analytical intelligence complemented Jonathan's legal training and first-hand knowledge of the enemy they faced, creating a combination of talents that would prove invaluable to Van Helsing and his allies. More importantly, their love for each other provided them both with the emotional strength necessary to face supernatural horrors that would have overwhelmed individuals acting alone. Their wedding took place in a small church in Budapest on the morning of their departure for England, performed by an elderly Anglican chaplain who served the British diplomatic community. The ceremony was simple and private, witnessed only by Dr. Steiner and two nurses from the hospital who had become fond of the young English couple during their stay. The rings were simple bands purchased from a local jeweler, and Mina's dress was a practical traveling costume rather than the elaborate gown she had once dreamed of wearing at her wedding. But the simplicity of the ceremony did not diminish its significance for either Jonathan or Mina. They understood that they were not merely exchanging vows of love and commitment, but entering into a partnership that would be tested by challenges that few marriages ever face. The knowledge that supernatural evil was stalking their homeland gave their union an urgency and intensity that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. As Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Harker boarded the Channel steamer that would carry them from Calais to Dover, both were acutely aware that they were returning to an England that was no longer the safe, rational country they had left months earlier. Count Dracula had successfully established himself in London, and his presence there represented a threat to everything they held dear about civilization and human decency. But they also knew that they possessed knowledge and experiences that might prove crucial in combating this threat, and they were determined to place themselves and their resources at the disposal of those who were already engaged in the fight. The crossing to England was rough, with autumn storms lashing the channel and making the voyage uncomfortable for all aboard. But Jonathan and Mina stood together on the deck as the white cliffs of Dover came into view through the rain and spray, both understanding that they were approaching not just their homeland, but the battlefield where the future of human civilization might be decided. They had survived the horrors of Castle Dracula and the trauma of separation and uncertainty, and now they were ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the gaslit streets of London. Unknown to them, Professor Van Helsing, Dr. Seward, and Arthur Holmwood were already making preparations for their arrival, having learned through their own investigations that Jonathan Harker possessed crucial information about the enemy they faced. The reunion of all these individuals would mark the beginning of the final phase of the campaign against Count Dracula, a battle that would test the limits of human courage and determination, while revealing truths about the nature of good and evil that none of them had ever imagined possible. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. The reunion of Jonathan and Mina Harker with their friends in London took place under circumstances that none of them could have anticipated when they had last been together in the innocent days before supernatural evil had intruded upon their lives. Dr. Seward's asylum in Purfleet had become an unofficial headquarters for the small group of individuals who now possessed knowledge of the vampire threat, and it was there that the full scope of Count Dracula's invasion plans began to emerge through the careful correlation of evidence and testimony. Professor Van Helsing had spent the weeks following Lucy's destruction in intensive research, using every resource at his disposal to learn more about the ancient vampire who had brought such horror to England. His investigations had led him deep into the dusty archives of European libraries and monasteries, where he had uncovered historical records that painted a picture of evil stretching back through centuries of bloodshed and corruption. What he had learned about Count Dracula was both fascinating and terrifying, revealing an enemy whose power and cunning exceeded anything they had previously imagined. The Count's mortal history could be traced back to the 15th century, when he had been known as Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, a Wallachian prince whose cruelty had been legendary even in an age accustomed to violence and brutality. Van Helsing's research suggested that Vlad's transformation into a vampire had occurred during the final years of his mortal life, when his desperate attempts to maintain power against overwhelming odds had led him to seek supernatural assistance through practices that damned his soul and transformed his body into something no longer human. But the historical Vlad Tepes had been merely a cruel human ruler whose evil had been limited by the constraints of mortality and the boundaries of his earthly domain. Count Dracula represented the evolution of that evil across centuries of undead existence, during which he had accumulated knowledge, power, and resources that made him a threat to civilization itself. Van Helsing's investigations revealed a pattern of expansion and conquest that had been proceeding slowly but steadily for hundreds of years, with England merely the latest target in a campaign that ultimately aimed at nothing less than the complete domination of the human species. The professor's research had also revealed disturbing information about the Count's methods and capabilities. Unlike the random, impulsive predators of popular vampire folklore, Count Dracula was a master strategist who planned his campaigns with military precision and scientific thoroughness. His invasion of England had been prepared through years of careful study and reconnaissance, with advanced preparations that included the establishment of safe houses, the recruitment of human servants, and the systematic identification of individuals who could serve his purposes as either victims or allies. Most alarming of all was Van Helsing's discovery that Count Dracula possessed knowledge and abilities that went far beyond those described in traditional vampire lore. His centuries of existence had given him time to master arts and sciences that were unknown to ordinary humans, including forms of mesmerism and mental control that made him capable of influencing people's actions even at a distance. He could command not only supernatural creatures like wolves and bats, but also human beings whose wills had been weakened by despair, mental illness, or moral corruption. The evidence for these expanded capabilities had been provided by Dr. Seward's own patient, R.M. Renfield, a man whose history of mental instability had made him an ideal target for vampiric influence. Renfield's condition had deteriorated dramatically in recent weeks, and his ravings now focused obsessively on the arrival of a master who would grant him eternal life in exchange for absolute servitude. The patient's knowledge of Count Dracula's movements and plans was unnaturally detailed, suggesting a form of supernatural communication that allowed the vampire to coordinate his activities through human agents scattered throughout London. When Jonathan and Mina arrived at the asylum and were introduced to Professor Van Helsing, the meeting marked the beginning of a partnership that would prove crucial to the ultimate defeat of Count Dracula. Jonathan's first-hand knowledge of the Count's castle, his methods, and his preparations for the English invasion provided the professor with invaluable intelligence that confirmed and expanded upon his own research. More importantly, Mina's analytical skills and organizational abilities gave the group the administrative support they needed to coordinate their activities and maintain the detailed records that would be essential to their success. The account that Jonathan provided of his experiences in Castle Dracula was received with varying degrees of acceptance by the different members of the group. Professor Van Helsing, whose long experience with supernatural phenomena had prepared him for such revelations, accepted Jonathan's testimony without question and immediately began incorporating it into his strategic planning. Dr. Seward, whose scientific training made him naturally skeptical of extraordinary claims, required more convincing, but was eventually persuaded by the correlation between Jonathan's account and the evidence they had already gathered about vampire activities in London. Arthur Holmwood's reaction was more complex, colored by his recent traumatic experience with Lucy's transformation and destruction. The knowledge that Count Dracula was personally responsible for Lucy's fate filled him with a rage that was both fierce and cleansing, providing him with a focus for his grief that made continued action possible rather than succumbing to despair. For Arthur, the campaign against Count Dracula had become a personal quest for justice that transcended any concerns about his own safety or social position. Mina's role in the group was initially limited by the Victorian conviction that women should be protected from knowledge and experiences that might prove harmful to their delicate sensibilities. Professor Van Helsing and the other men were reluctant to involve her directly in their planning, preferring to shield her from the darker aspects of their work while making use of her clerical skills to maintain their records and correspondence. But Mina's intelligence and determination gradually overcame these conventional restrictions, and she became an increasingly important strategic advisor whose insights often proved more valuable than those of her male colleagues. The intelligence that emerged from the combination of Jonathan's experiences, Van Helsing's research, and their ongoing surveillance of vampire activities in London painted a picture of an invasion that was far more extensive and sophisticated than they had initially realized. Count Dracula had not simply taken up residence in England. He had established a comprehensive infrastructure that would allow him to operate throughout the country with minimal risk of detection or interference. The 50 boxes of Transylvanian earth that had been shipped aboard the Demeter were the key to this infrastructure. Each box served as a potential resting place where the Count could take refuge during daylight hours, and their distribution throughout London and the surrounding areas meant that he could travel widely without being limited to a single lair. Van Helsing's investigations had revealed that these boxes had been placed in locations that provided strategic advantages: abandoned buildings, forgotten cellars, remote estates, all of them chosen to maximize the Count's mobility while minimizing the chances of discovery. More disturbing still was the realization that Count Dracula's plans extended far beyond the simple acquisition of hunting grounds. The vampire's systematic study of English society, law, and customs suggested that he intended to integrate himself into the power structures of the nation, using his supernatural abilities and accumulated wealth to gain influence over political and economic institutions. His ultimate goal appeared to be nothing less than the gradual transformation of England itself into a vampire state, with himself as the supreme ruler of a population that would serve as both subjects and prey. The scope of this threat made it clear that the small group of individuals who currently possessed knowledge of Count Dracula's true nature would be entirely inadequate to mount an effective defense. Van Helsing estimated that they had perhaps a few weeks before the vampire's influence became so well established that conventional resistance would be impossible. They needed to act quickly and decisively, using every resource at their disposal to locate and destroy the Count before he could complete his plans for conquest. The strategy that Van Helsing developed was based on the fundamental limitations that governed vampire existence, constraints that even Count Dracula's centuries of experience had not enabled him to overcome. The Count was vulnerable during daylight hours, when his supernatural powers were greatly reduced, and he was forced to remain in close proximity to the earth that sustained his undead existence. If they could locate all of his resting places and systematically destroy them, they could eventually force him into a position where he would have no choice but to flee England or face destruction. But this strategy required resources and capabilities that their small group did not possess. They needed to conduct simultaneous operations at multiple locations throughout London, coordinate surveillance activities across a wide area, and maintain security that would prevent Count Dracula from learning of their plans and taking countermeasures. Most importantly, they needed to accomplish all of this while maintaining their normal social and professional obligations, since any sudden changes in their behavior might alert the vampire to the threat they represented. The solution to these logistical challenges came from an unexpected source. Arthur Holmwood's position in English society provided him with access to resources and personnel that could be mobilized for their campaign without arousing suspicion. His family's business interests included shipping companies, real estate firms, and private security services that could be directed to gather intelligence about property transactions, shipping records, and other activities related to Count Dracula's operations. Meanwhile, Dr. Seward's position at the asylum gave the group access to medical and scientific resources that might prove valuable in their investigations. His patients included individuals from many different social backgrounds, some of whom might have encountered supernatural phenomena without understanding their significance. More importantly, the asylum's location near one of Count Dracula's suspected lairs made it an ideal base of operations for surveillance and reconnaissance activities. Jonathan's legal training proved invaluable in navigating the complex web of property laws, business regulations, and administrative procedures that governed activities in Victorian London. His knowledge of how legal systems could be manipulated or circumvented allowed the group to conduct their investigations without alerting authorities who might interfere with their mission. Moreover, his intimate knowledge of Count Dracula's methods and psychology provided insights that helped them anticipate the vampire's likely responses to their activities. But it was Mina who emerged as the true strategic coordinator of their campaign, despite the initial reluctance of the men to involve her fully in their planning. Her ability to organize complex information, identify patterns in seemingly unrelated data, and maintain detailed records of their progress proved essential to the success of their operations. More importantly, her emotional stability and practical intelligence provided a steadying influence that helped to maintain group cohesion under the extraordinary stresses they faced. As autumn deepened into winter and their campaign against Count Dracula began in earnest, each member of the group was forced to confront personal challenges that tested the limits of their courage and determination. They were no longer ordinary citizens going about their normal lives, but soldiers in a war against supernatural evil that demanded sacrifices and compromises that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The knowledge that they possessed about the true nature of the threat they faced was both a source of strength and a terrible burden. They understood the stakes involved in their campaign, not merely their own lives and safety, but the future of human civilization itself. Count Dracula represented an evil so ancient and powerful that his successful establishment in England could lead to the gradual corruption of the entire Western world, with consequences that would echo through generations yet unborn. But this knowledge also isolated them from the rest of humanity, creating a sense of lonely responsibility that was sometimes almost overwhelming. They could not share their fears and concerns with families and friends, who would never believe the truth about what they faced. And they could not seek assistance from authorities who would dismiss their warnings as the products of madness or delusion. They were entirely dependent on their own resources and determination, with no prospect of outside help should their efforts fail. As they prepared for the direct confrontation with Count Dracula that they knew must come, each member of the group was acutely aware that they might not survive the experience. The vampire's power and cunning had been demonstrated repeatedly, and his centuries of experience in dealing with human adversaries gave him significant advantages in any direct conflict. But they were equally aware that retreat or compromise was impossible, since failure would mean not only their own destruction but the triumph of an evil that would spread like a plague throughout the civilized world. The stage was now set for the final battle between the forces of light and darkness, good and evil, life and undeath. In the gaslit streets of London, where the greatest achievements of human civilization stood side by side with the ancient shadows where predators still stalked their prey, Count Dracula and his small band of human enemies prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of all humanity. Chapter 11. The Hunt Begins. The systematic campaign to locate and destroy Count Dracula's resting places throughout London began on a cold November morning when the fog hung thick over the Thames and the early industrial activity of the great city provided perfect cover for clandestine operations. Professor Van Helsing had divided his small army into teams, each responsible for investigating specific areas where the vampire's boxes of cursed earth were believed to have been hidden, and each equipped with the specialized tools and knowledge necessary to deal with supernatural threats. The professor himself, accompanied by Dr. Seward, took responsibility for the most challenging target, the estate at Carfax, which lay adjacent to the asylum and which their investigations had identified as Count Dracula's primary residence in England. This property had been purchased through a complex series of legal transactions that Jonathan's research had revealed to be characteristic of the vampire's methods, carefully structured to avoid scrutiny, while providing maximum security and privacy for activities that could not bear official investigation. Carfax was an ancient estate that had fallen into decay through years of neglect and mismanagement. Its once grand mansion, now little more than a crumbling ruin surrounded by overgrown gardens and outbuildings that provided perfect concealment for supernatural activities. The property's isolation, despite its proximity to London, made it an ideal headquarters for a creature that required absolute privacy during the vulnerable hours of daylight and easy access to hunting grounds during the darkness of night. Arthur Holmwood and Jonathan Harker formed the second team, responsible for investigating a warehouse district near the London docks where shipping records indicated that several of Count Dracula's earth boxes had been delivered. This area was chosen for its commercial activity and transient population, factors that would allow the vampire to move freely without attracting the attention of permanent residents who might notice unusual patterns of behavior. Mina Harker, despite the continued objections of her male colleagues who worried about exposing her to supernatural dangers, had insisted on conducting her own independent investigation of property records and business transactions related to the vampire's activities. Her work was based in the reading rooms of various London libraries and government offices, where her skills as a researcher and her ability to identify significant patterns in complex data made her invaluable to the overall campaign. The tools and equipment that each team carried reflected Professor Van Helsing's deep understanding of vampire folklore and his practical experience in dealing with supernatural threats. Each investigator was armed with crucifixes, holy water, communion wafers, and wooden stakes that had been blessed by clergy from multiple Christian denominations. They also carried more conventional weapons, revolvers loaded with silver bullets, knives with blades forged from consecrated metal, and lanterns designed to produce the brightest possible light in the event that they encountered the vampire during their searches. More importantly, Van Helsing had prepared each team member with detailed knowledge of vampire capabilities and limitations, ensuring that they understood both the dangers they faced and the methods that could be used to protect themselves. He emphasized repeatedly that Count Dracula was not merely a powerful predator, but an intelligent adversary who would anticipate their actions and take countermeasures to protect himself and his resources. The investigation of Carfax began before dawn, when the vampire would be at his most vulnerable and least likely to detect their intrusion. Van Helsing and Dr. Seward approached the estate through the grounds of the asylum, using their legitimate access to that property to avoid the main gates and approach roads that might be watched by the Count's supernatural senses or human agents. The mansion itself was a monument to architectural decay, its Gothic revival facade crumbling under the weight of weather and neglect, its windows either broken or boarded shut. Its roof collapsed in several places to reveal the skeletal framework of rotting timber beneath. But Van Helsing's careful examination of the building revealed signs of recent habitation that were invisible to casual observation, tracks in the dust that suggested regular movement through the corridors, areas where accumulated debris had been cleared away, and subtle modifications to doors and windows that would facilitate rapid entry and exit. Most significantly, the professor's sensitive nose detected the distinctive smell that he had learned to associate with vampire lairs, a combination of old earth, decay, and something else that suggested the presence of undead flesh. This scent led them through the mansion's maze of ruined rooms to a heavy wooden door that opened onto stone steps, leading down into the building's cellars and foundations. The underground areas of Carfax proved to be far more extensive than the mansion's exterior appearance suggested, with chambers and passages that had been carved from the living chalk centuries earlier, and which now served as perfect hiding places for the vampire's most precious possessions. Van Helsing's lantern illuminated walls that wept with moisture, floors covered with the accumulated dust of decades, and alcoves that seemed to have been designed specifically to accommodate the rectangular boxes that were the key to Count Dracula's power. They found 29 of the boxes in the deepest chambers of Carfax, each one filled with the dark earth of Transylvania and marked with symbols that Van Helsing recognized as protective sigils from the vampire's homeland. The professor worked methodically to consecrate each box with holy water and communion wafers, rendering the earth within useless to the vampire, while ensuring that it could never again serve as a resting place for any creature of the undead. Dr. Seward documented their discoveries in careful detail, recording not only the number and location of the boxes but also observations about the physical layout of the underground chambers and any evidence of recent vampire activity. His scientific training made him naturally inclined to treat their investigation as a form of field research, and his notes would prove invaluable in understanding the full scope of Count Dracula's operations in England. Meanwhile, Arthur and Jonathan were conducting their own search in the warehouse district, where their investigation had revealed a pattern of property rentals and shipping activities that suggested the presence of vampire resources. The commercial nature of this area made their work both easier and more difficult. Easier because their presence during business hours would not attract attention, but more difficult because the constant activity of legitimate commerce made it challenging to identify specifically supernatural elements. Their breakthrough came when Jonathan's legal expertise enabled him to trace a series of property transactions back to a shell company that existed only on paper but which had been used to rent storage space in 3 different warehouse facilities. Each of these locations had received deliveries from the cargo that had arrived aboard the ill-fated Demeter, and Jonathan's examination of the shipping records revealed the telltale signatures of Count Dracula's careful planning and attention to detail. The first warehouse they investigated contained 12 boxes of earth, stored in a basement that had been modified to prevent any possibility of water damage or unauthorized access. Arthur's social connections proved valuable in gaining entry to the facility, as the warehouse owner was eager to accommodate a member of the nobility even when the request for access seemed somewhat irregular. The boxes were consecrated and rendered harmless using the same methods that Van Helsing had employed at Carfax, though both men found the work emotionally draining as they contemplated the evil purposes these innocent-looking containers had been designed to serve. Mina's research, conducted in the comfortable surroundings of London's great libraries, was producing results that were perhaps even more significant than the field investigations being carried out by her male colleagues. Her systematic examination of property records, shipping manifests, and business registrations had revealed the full scope of Count Dracula's invasion plans and the sophisticated infrastructure he had established to support his activities in England. The pattern that emerged from Mina's analysis was both comprehensive and terrifying. Count Dracula had not simply purchased Carfax and a few additional properties. He had systematically acquired real estate throughout London and the surrounding counties, creating a network of safe houses and storage facilities that would allow him to operate virtually anywhere in southeastern England. The legal mechanisms he had used were complex and carefully designed to obscure his identity, while providing unquestioned legal title to properties that would serve his supernatural purposes. More disturbing still was Mina's discovery that Count Dracula's preparations had begun years before his actual arrival in England. The earliest property transactions she could trace dated back nearly a decade, suggesting that the vampire had been planning his invasion with patience and thoroughness that spoke of centuries of experience in conquest and colonization. This was not an opportunistic predator seeking new hunting grounds, but a master strategist implementing a carefully developed plan for the systematic corruption of an entire nation. As the teams continued their work throughout the day, they maintained communication through a system of coded messages that Mina had developed to ensure their coordination while preventing any interception of their plans by hostile forces. The Count's ability to influence human minds meant that even innocent bystanders might serve as unwitting sources of intelligence for the vampire, making operational security a matter of life and death for everyone involved in the campaign. By late afternoon, their combined efforts had located and neutralized 41 of the 50 boxes that Count Dracula had brought to England, a success rate that exceeded Van Helsing's most optimistic projections. But the professor warned against premature celebration, knowing that the vampire would quickly become aware of the destruction of his resources and would undoubtedly take immediate action to protect the remaining boxes while striking back at his enemies. The proof of Van Helsing's concerns came that evening, when the group reconvened at Dr. Seward's asylum to compare notes and plan their next moves. Renfield, the patient whose mental condition had made him susceptible to vampiric influence, was found in his cell in a state of extreme agitation, raving about his master's anger and the terrible revenge that would be taken against those who had dared to interfere with the Count's plans. Dr. Seward's examination of his patient revealed that Renfield had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of their activities, despite having been securely confined throughout the day with no apparent means of communication with the outside world. The patient spoke with disturbing accuracy about the locations where boxes had been destroyed, the methods that had been used to consecrate them, and even personal details about the individuals involved in the operations. More alarming still, Renfield's ravings included threats against specific members of their group, with particular emphasis on Mina, whom the patient referred to as the one who sees too much and knows too much for her own good. Van Helsing recognized in these words the voice of Count Dracula himself, speaking through his human servant to deliver warnings and threats to his enemies. The implications of Renfield's supernatural knowledge were sobering for everyone involved in the campaign. If Count Dracula could monitor their activities through his human agents, then their operational security had been compromised from the beginning, and the vampire was undoubtedly already taking steps to protect his remaining resources while preparing for direct retaliation against his enemies. Van Helsing's response was characteristically decisive and comprehensive. First, he ordered the immediate relocation of Mina to a secure location where she would be protected by multiple layers of both physical and supernatural defenses. The Count's specific threats against her suggested that he recognized her value to their operations and intended to eliminate her before she could cause further damage to his plans. Second, the professor restructured their remaining operations to assume that Count Dracula was aware of their general strategy and would be taking countermeasures to protect his remaining boxes while seeking opportunities to strike back at enemies. This meant that future operations would need to be planned with even greater care and executed with maximum speed and efficiency to prevent the vampire from intervening. Finally, Van Helsing began preparations for the direct confrontation with Count Dracula that he now believed was inevitable. The systematic destruction of the vampire's resting places would eventually force him to defend his remaining resources personally, creating an opportunity for his enemies to engage him in battle on terms that might favor their cause. The safe house that was chosen for Mina's protection was a property owned by Arthur's family, located in a quiet residential district where unusual activities would be noticed by neighbors who could be trusted to report suspicious behavior to the authorities. The building was fortified with every protective measure that Van Helsing's extensive knowledge could provide: crucifixes at every door and window, garlic hung in every room, communion wafers ground into powder and mixed with the mortar of the walls, and holy water sprinkled throughout the structure. But these conventional protections were supplemented by more sophisticated defenses that reflected the professor's understanding of Count Dracula's specific capabilities and limitations. The approaches to the building were designed to channel any attacker through areas where they would be exposed to concentrated firepower from multiple defenders, and the interior layout was modified to create multiple fallback positions that could be defended even if the outer perimeters were breached. Most importantly, the safe house was staffed by individuals who understood the nature of the threat they faced and who possessed both the knowledge and the courage necessary to deal with supernatural attacks. Van Helsing himself took personal responsibility for Mina's security, while Dr. Seward and Arthur maintained their surveillance of the remaining vampire lairs and continued the systematic search for boxes that had not yet been located and destroyed. Jonathan's role in these operations was complicated by his personal relationship with Mina and his desire to remain close to her during what was clearly a period of extreme danger. But he also understood that his legal expertise and intimate knowledge of Count Dracula's methods made him invaluable to the continued success of their campaign, and he reluctantly agreed to continue his field investigations while trusting in Van Helsing's ability to protect his wife. The emotional strain of this separation was intense for both Jonathan and Mina, but it was balanced by their shared understanding of the stakes involved in their struggle against Count Dracula. They were not merely fighting for their own lives and safety, but for the future of human civilization itself, and personal considerations had to be subordinated to the larger requirements of their mission. As night fell over London and the gaslights flickered to life in the streets and squares of the great city, each member of Van Helsing's small army prepared for what they knew might be their final battle against the forces of supernatural evil. Count Dracula was now aware that he faced organized and knowledgeable opposition, and his response would undoubtedly be swift, decisive, and utterly ruthless. The vampire's centuries of experience in warfare and conquest had taught him that the most effective defense was often a crushing offensive that destroyed one's enemies before they could consolidate their advantages or bring their full strength to bear. Van Helsing and his allies had succeeded in destroying the majority of the Count's earthen boxes, but they had also revealed themselves as threats that could not be allowed to continue their operations. Somewhere in the darkness of London, Count Dracula was preparing his counterattack, drawing upon powers and resources that his human enemies could barely comprehend. The ancient vampire had not survived for centuries by allowing challenges to his authority to go unanswered, and the systematic destruction of his carefully prepared resources demanded a response that would serve both as revenge against his current enemies and as a warning to any future opponents who might consider challenging his power. The final phase of the battle between light and darkness was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether London would remain a bastion of human civilization or become the seat of an undead empire that would spread its corruption across the entire world. In the safe house where Mina was hidden, in the asylum where Dr. Seward maintained his vigil, and in the streets where Arthur and Jonathan continued their dangerous work. The defenders of humanity prepared for a confrontation that would test every limit of their courage, determination, and faith in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Chapter 12. The Count's Revenge. The attack came at the darkest hour before dawn, when the fog had thickened to an almost supernatural density and the normal sounds of London's awakening were muffled to whispers that seemed to come from another world. Count Dracula had chosen his moment with the strategic brilliance that had served him through centuries of warfare, striking when his human enemies were at their most vulnerable, and his own supernatural powers were approaching their nightly peak. Dr. Seward was the first to become aware that something was wrong. Alerted by the sudden agitation of patients throughout his asylum, who began crying out in their cells as though responding to some stimulus that only they could perceive. Renfield, in particular, became almost frenzied in his excitement, laughing maniacally and shouting words of welcome and submission to a master whose presence he could somehow sense despite the thick walls that separated him from the outside world. The doctor's attempts to calm his patients were interrupted by the arrival of a message from the safe house where Mina was being protected. A hastily scrawled note that spoke of supernatural phenomena manifesting around the building, and Van Helsing's urgent request for immediate assistance. Dr. Seward grabbed his medical bag, which now contained more consecrated weapons than conventional medicines, and set out through the fog-shrouded streets toward what he feared might already be a scene of tragedy and defeat. At the safe house, Van Helsing had been maintaining his vigilant watch over Mina when the temperature in the building suddenly dropped to nearly freezing levels, despite the warm fires that had been burning in every fireplace. The professor's sensitive awareness of supernatural forces immediately recognized this phenomena as a sign that Count Dracula was using his powers to penetrate the protective barriers that had been established around the building. The vampire's assault began subtly, with shadows that moved independently of any objects that might cast them and sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves rather than from any external source. Van Helsing responded by reinforcing the spiritual defenses around Mina's room, sprinkling additional holy water, and pressing communion wafers against every possible point of entry while reciting prayers in Latin that had been used against supernatural evil for over 1,000 years. But Count Dracula's power had grown during his weeks in England, fed by the blood he had taken from numerous victims and strengthened by his successful establishment of multiple lairs throughout the city. The protective measures that had proved effective against lesser vampires were insufficient to stop an adversary whose abilities had been honed by centuries of practice and who possessed knowledge of dark arts that predated Christianity itself. The breakthrough came when the vampire manifested himself as a thick mist that seeped through cracks in the building's foundation, a form that allowed him to bypass many of the traditional barriers that would have stopped his physical body. Van Helsing watched in growing alarm as this supernatural fog began to take human shape in the corner of Mina's room, coalescing into the tall, imposing figure of Count Dracula himself. The Count's appearance was both magnificent and terrifying, his pale aristocratic features animated by an intelligence that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom and malevolence. He was dressed in evening clothes of perfect cut and fit, his white hair swept back from his high forehead, his burning eyes fixed upon Mina with an intensity that made Van Helsing's blood run cold. But it was the aura of power that surrounded the vampire that was most intimidating, a sense of ancient authority and supernatural strength that made resistance seem both futile and presumptuous. "Professor Van Helsing," Count Dracula said, his voice carrying the musical accent that had once charmed Jonathan Harker, but which now resonated with barely controlled rage. "Your reputation for meddling in affairs that do not concern you has preceded you, but I confess myself surprised by the extent of the damage you and your allies have managed to inflict upon my carefully laid plans. 41 of my resting places destroyed, my shipping operations disrupted, my very presence in England revealed to those who should have remained ignorant of such matters. Truly, you have proven yourself a worthy adversary." Van Helsing stood between the vampire and Mina's bed, a crucifix in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other, his aged frame trembling with the effort required to resist the Count's supernatural charisma. "Your evil will not triumph here, Count Dracula," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that coursed through his veins. "England is not Transylvania, and we are not the helpless peasants you have preyed upon for centuries. You face now the might of Christian civilization, and you will find us more formidable opponents than you anticipated." The Count's laughter was like the sound of winter wind through a cemetery, cold and mocking, and utterly without humor. "Christian civilization? Is that what you call the industrial slums of London, where children starve in the shadows of great wealth? Is that what you call the opium dens and gin houses, where your fellow Christians seek escape from the misery of their daily existence? I have seen your civilization, Professor, and I find it little different from the barbarism that I left behind in the mountains of my homeland." As the two adversaries faced each other across the small room, Mina lay unconscious on the bed between them, her face pale and peaceful in the lamplight, but her breathing shallow and irregular, in a way that spoke of supernatural influence. Van Helsing realized with growing horror that Count Dracula had somehow been affecting her even through the protective barriers they had erected, draining her life force while they remained unaware of the attack. "You see how powerless your protections truly are," the Count continued, moving closer to the bed with movements that seemed to flow like water. "Distance means nothing to one such as I, and physical barriers are merely inconveniences to be overcome through the application of sufficient will and knowledge. Your Mina has been mine for days now, her blood calling to me across the miles that separate us, her dreams filled with visions of the eternal existence that awaits her at my side." The revelation that Mina had been under vampiric influence despite all their precautions struck Van Helsing like a physical blow, but it also filled him with the fierce determination of a man who has nothing left to lose. If Count Dracula had indeed been feeding on Mina's blood and corrupting her soul, then the battle for her salvation was already in its final stages, and desperate measures would be required to prevent her transformation into one of the undead. Van Helsing's response was immediate and uncompromising. He threw the holy water at Count Dracula, while simultaneously pressing the crucifix against the vampire's face, invoking the protection of every saint whose name he could remember, and calling upon the divine power that had sustained him through a lifetime of combat against supernatural evil. The effect was dramatic. The Count recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage, his perfect features contorting into something bestial and horrifying as the sacred symbols burned his undead flesh. But the vampire's retreat was only temporary, a tactical withdrawal rather than a genuine defeat. As Van Helsing moved to check on Mina's condition, Count Dracula struck back with supernatural speed and strength, his pale hands closing around the professor's throat with crushing force that threatened to snap his neck like a dry twig. "You dare to oppose me with your pitiful symbols and meaningless prayers?" the Count hissed, his face now showing his true nature as his fangs extended and his eyes burned with the fire of hell itself. "I, who commanded armies when your ancestors were painting themselves with mud and worshipping trees. I, who have dined on the blood of kings and emperors while you waste your life healing the ailments of peasants and madmen." Van Helsing struggled desperately against the vampire's superhuman grip, but his aged body was no match for the undead strength that held him. His vision began to darken as his air supply was cut off, and he felt consciousness slipping away even as he continued to fight with every remaining ounce of his strength and will. It was at this critical moment that help arrived in the form of Dr. Seward, Arthur Holmwood, and Jonathan Harker, who had been alerted to the crisis by the professor's earlier message and who burst into the room with weapons drawn and protective symbols ready. Their sudden appearance forced Count Dracula to release Van Helsing and turn to face these new threats, his supernatural senses immediately assessing the danger they represented and calculating the best means of dealing with multiple armed opponents. But the Count's moment of distraction was exactly what Van Helsing needed to recover his strength and launch a coordinated counterattack. As the three younger men advanced with crucifixes and wooden stakes, the professor moved to Mina's bedside and began the emergency procedures that might save her from complete vampiric corruption. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he placed communion wafers on her forehead and lips, sprinkled holy water over her unconscious form, and began the Latin incantations that could sometimes reverse the early stages of vampire influence. Count Dracula's response to this multi-pronged assault was swift and terrifying. Rather than attempting to fight four armed opponents simultaneously, he transformed himself into a cloud of mist that swirled around the room like a miniature tornado, avoiding their weapons while seeking an opportunity to strike at the most vulnerable target. The supernatural fog seemed to have a malevolent intelligence of its own, probing for weaknesses in their defenses while maintaining a constant, disorienting movement that made accurate strikes impossible. Jonathan's confrontation with the creature that had held him prisoner in Castle Dracula was deeply personal, colored by months of psychological trauma and the burning desire for revenge against the monster that had nearly destroyed his sanity. But his anger was tempered by the tactical knowledge he had gained during his captivity, and he understood Count Dracula's methods well enough to anticipate some of the vampire's likely strategies. As the mist swirled around them, Jonathan suddenly threw open the heavy curtains that had been covering the room's windows, allowing the first rays of dawn sunlight to penetrate the chamber. The effect on Count Dracula was immediate and dramatic. The mist condensed rapidly back into human form as the vampire was forced to abandon his supernatural manifestation by the power of natural light. But even weakened by the approaching sunrise, Count Dracula remained a formidable and dangerous opponent. His centuries of combat experience gave him tactical advantages that his younger adversaries could not match, and his supernatural speed and strength made him capable of inflicting devastating damage even in his reduced state. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate, with both sides fighting with the knowledge that defeat would mean not merely death, but damnation. Arthur's attack was driven by rage over Lucy's fate, and his assault on the Count was characterized by the reckless bravery of a man who cared more about revenge than personal survival. His wooden stake found its mark in the vampire's shoulder, causing Count Dracula to cry out in pain and fury, while black blood flowed from the wound like ink from a broken pen. Dr. Seward's medical training served him well in the chaotic combat, as he was able to anticipate and counter many of the vampire's moves, while providing support to his companions when they were pressed by the Count's supernatural abilities. His silver-bladed knife opened several minor wounds on the vampire's hands and arms, each cut causing Count Dracula to recoil as though he had been burned. But it was Van Helsing who delivered the most effective blow, pressing a large crucifix directly against the vampire's forehead, while reciting an exorcism in a voice that rang with absolute faith and authority. The sacred symbol burned into Count Dracula's flesh with a sizzling sound like hot metal against ice, leaving a permanent mark that would serve as evidence of their encounter for whatever time remained to the ancient vampire. Faced with multiple armed opponents, weakened by the approaching sunrise, and bearing wounds that would take time to heal even with his supernatural resilience, Count Dracula was forced to acknowledge that this battle could not be won through direct confrontation. But his retreat was not a surrender. It was a tactical withdrawal that allowed him to deliver one final, devastating blow against his enemies before seeking the safety of his remaining lairs. The Count's parting gesture was both brilliant and cruel, directed against the member of their group who was most vulnerable and whose loss would cause the greatest psychological damage to his opponents. As the vampire prepared to transform himself into mist and escape through the window, he bent over Mina's unconscious form and sank his fangs into her throat, drinking deeply of her blood while pressing a self-inflicted wound on his own chest against her lips. "She is mine now," he whispered as his form began to dissolve into supernatural fog. "The blood bond has been established, and she will come to me willingly when the transformation is complete. You have won this battle, but you have lost the war, for I have taken from you the one whose loss will destroy your unity and render your future efforts meaningless." The implications of Count Dracula's words struck the four men like physical blows as they realized what had just occurred. The vampire had not merely fed upon Mina's blood, he had forced her to drink his own unholy essence, creating the supernatural bond that would gradually transform her into one of the undead. Unless they could find some means of reversing this corruption, Mina would eventually become a creature like Lucy, beautiful and terrible and eternally hungry for the blood of the innocent. Van Helsing's examination of Mina confirmed their worst fears. The marks on her throat were deeper and more pronounced than any they had seen before, and when he attempted to place a communion wafer on her forehead, it left a red burn mark on her skin that identified her as someone who had been touched by vampiric corruption. The transformation had begun, and they had perhaps a few days before it became irreversible. But even in the face of this devastating setback, Van Helsing refused to abandon hope or surrender to despair. Count Dracula had revealed his location and intentions through his attack on Mina, and the approaching sunrise would force him to take refuge in one of his remaining lairs. The vampire had won this battle, But the war was far from over, and the professor was already beginning to formulate plans for a counterattack that would use the Count's own methods against him. The hunt for Count Dracula was about to enter its final and most dangerous phase, with Mina's life and soul hanging in the balance, and the fate of all England depending on their ability to track down and destroy the most powerful vampire who had ever threatened the civilized world. Time was running out, but Van Helsing and his allies were far from defeated, and they would use every resource at their disposal to save Mina and rid the world of Count Dracula's evil once and for all. Chapter 13. The Final Hunt. The race to save Mina's soul and destroy Count Dracula before his corruption of her became irreversible began immediately after the vampire's escape from the safe house. As Professor Van Helsing and his companions realized that they now faced a deadline that could not be extended or negotiated. The blood bond that Count Dracula had established with Mina through his attack would gradually transform her into one of the undead, unless they could locate and destroy her supernatural tormentor within a matter of days. Van Helsing's first priority was to stabilize Mina's condition and slow the progress of her vampiric corruption through every means at his disposal. The communion wafer that had burned her forehead confirmed that the transformation had begun, but the professor's extensive knowledge of vampire lore suggested that the process might be halted or even reversed if Count Dracula could be destroyed before it was complete. This gave them hope, but it also imposed a time limit that made their mission far more urgent and dangerous than it had been before. The protective measures that Van Helsing established around Mina were more comprehensive than anything he had attempted before, combining traditional religious symbols with more esoteric elements drawn from his decades of study and practical experience. Her room was surrounded by multiple circles of consecrated salt, garlic, and holy water, while crucifixes were placed at every possible point of entry and communion. Wafers were ground into powder and mixed with the very mortar of the walls. But the most significant protection came from Mina herself, whose strong will and natural resistance to evil provided a bulwark against the vampire's influence that no external barrier could match. Van Helsing explained to her the nature of her condition and the process that was beginning within her body and soul, trusting in her intelligence and courage to help her fight against the corruption from within while they worked to destroy its source from without. Mina's response to this terrible knowledge was characteristic of her practical nature and indomitable spirit. Rather than succumbing to despair or denial, she immediately began organizing her thoughts and memories to provide her companions with every possible advantage in their hunt for Count Dracula. The blood bond that threatened to destroy her also created a supernatural connection that might be used against the vampire, allowing her to sense his location and intentions in ways that could prove invaluable to their mission. Under Van Helsing's careful guidance, Mina submitted to hypnotic sessions that allowed her to access the vampire's thoughts and experiences through their shared blood. These sessions were dangerous for her, as each contact with Count Dracula's mind increased the risk of her own corruption, but they provided intelligence about the vampire's plans and whereabouts that could not have been obtained through any conventional means. The information that emerged from these supernatural communications painted a picture of a vampire in retreat, but far from defeated. Count Dracula had indeed been weakened by the destruction of so many of his earthen resting places, but he retained enough resources to continue his campaign of conquest if given time to consolidate his remaining strongholds and recruit new human servants to replace those who had been lost or compromised. Most alarming of all was Mina's discovery that Count Dracula was preparing to abandon England temporarily, planning to return to Transylvania, where he could recover his strength and begin preparations for a renewed invasion. If the vampire succeeded in escaping their pursuit, he would undoubtedly return in a few years with new strategies and resources that would make him virtually impossible to defeat. Their current campaign represented humanity's best and perhaps only opportunity to rid the world of his evil permanently. The intelligence gathered through Mina's supernatural connection also revealed the location of Count Dracula's final refuge in England, a house in Piccadilly that he had purchased as a secure retreat in the heart of London itself. This property was more heavily fortified than his other lairs, protected by both supernatural barriers and human servants who had been corrupted through years of exposure to vampiric influence. Attacking it would require careful planning and maximum coordination, as any failure would alert the vampire to their approach and give him the opportunity to escape their grasp forever. Van Helsing's strategy for this final assault was based on the lessons learned from their previous encounters with Count Dracula and his supernatural resources. Rather than attempting a direct frontal attack that would give the vampire time to prepare his defenses or escape through transformation into mist, they would coordinate simultaneous strikes against all of his remaining strongholds while he was trapped in his daylight sleep and unable to respond effectively. Jonathan and Arthur were assigned the task of locating and destroying the last of the earthen boxes that had not yet been found, using the intelligence provided by Mina's supernatural connection to identify their hiding places. This work had to be completed before the main assault on the Piccadilly house could begin, as any remaining refuge would provide Count Dracula with an alternative retreat if their primary attack failed to achieve complete success. Dr. Seward was responsible for coordinating the medical and scientific aspects of their campaign, ensuring that they had adequate supplies of consecrated weapons and protective materials, while also maintaining careful observation of Mina's condition. His role was particularly critical because he would need to determine the exact moment when Count Dracula's destruction had broken the blood bond that threatened Mina's humanity. Van Helsing himself would lead the assault on the Piccadilly house, supported by a team of hired men whose loyalty had been secured through Arthur's wealth and whose courage had been strengthened through careful exposure to the truth about the supernatural threats they faced. These men were not fully informed about the nature of their enemy, but they understood that they were fighting against a criminal organization of unusual danger and resources. The coordination of these multiple operations required precise timing and flawless communication, as any delay or miscommunication could alert Count Dracula to their plans and give him the opportunity to escape or strike back against their most vulnerable members. Van Helsing established a system of coded signals and backup plans that would allow them to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the overall coherence of their strategy. The final phase of their hunt began at dawn on a December morning, when the London fog provided perfect concealment for their clandestine activities. Jonathan and Arthur moved systematically through the city, locating and destroying the remaining earthen boxes with methodical efficiency, while Van Helsing prepared for the assault on Count Dracula's final stronghold. The Piccadilly house proved to be a magnificent townhouse, whose elegant exterior concealed preparations for supernatural warfare that would have challenged the most experienced vampire hunter. The building's approaches were monitored by human servants, whose minds had been corrupted by years of vampiric influence, making them fanatically loyal to their undead master, while rendering them immune to conventional persuasion or bribery. Van Helsing's assault team encountered fierce resistance as they fought their way through the house's multiple defensive positions, each room presenting new challenges that tested their courage and resourcefulness. The human servants fought with supernatural determination, showing no concern for their own safety while attempting to protect their master's resting place from invasion and destruction. But the professor's careful planning and superior knowledge of vampire capabilities gradually overcame the defenders' desperate resistance. Room by room, floor by floor, they advanced toward the cellar where their supernatural enemy lay in his death-like sleep, protected by the last of his precious earth from the homeland that had sustained his undead existence for centuries. The discovery of Count Dracula's resting place marked the climax of their long campaign against supernatural evil. The vampire lay in his ornate coffin, surrounded by the last box of Transylvanian earth, his pale features peaceful in death-like sleep, but his presence radiating an aura of malevolent power that made the very air around him seem thick and oppressive. Van Helsing approached the coffin with weapons that had been consecrated by clergy from multiple Christian denominations, each item blessed specifically for use against the ancient evil they now faced. The wooden stake was carved from ash that had grown in the shadow of Westminster Abbey. The hammer had been forged from silver donated by a dozen churches, and the blade that would complete their work had been tempered in holy water from the Jordan River itself. As the professor raised the stake above Count Dracula's heart, the vampire's eyes suddenly opened, revealing orbs that burned with the accumulated malevolence of centuries of evil. But the approaching sunrise had weakened him beyond the point where effective resistance was possible, and his supernatural powers were insufficient to overcome the spiritual authority that Van Helsing brought to bear against him. So ends the reign of Count Dracula, Van Helsing said as he drove the stake through the vampire's heart with a single powerful blow. May God have mercy on your soul, though you showed none to your countless victims. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Count Dracula's body convulsed as though struck by lightning, his back arching and his limbs thrashing with supernatural strength that gradually faded as his unholy life force drained away. But unlike Lucy's peaceful transformation at the moment of her destruction, the ancient vampire's features showed no sign of redemption or relief, only the rage and hatred of a creature whose evil had been too deeply ingrained to be purged even by death. As Count Dracula's body crumbled into dust that was scattered by the morning wind, Van Helsing felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The blood bond that had threatened Mina's humanity was broken, her transformation was halted and reversed, and the supernatural threat that had menaced England was finally eliminated. The long campaign against vampiric evil was over, and the forces of light and civilization had emerged victorious. But even in victory, Van Helsing understood that their success had come at a tremendous cost. Quincy Morris, the brave American who had joined their cause out of love for Lucy, had fallen during the final assault, his life given freely in service to a cause greater than himself. His sacrifice would be remembered and honored by those who survived, but it served as a sobering reminder of the price that must sometimes be paid for victory over supernatural evil. Epilogue: 7 years hence. 7 years have passed since the destruction of Count Dracula and the liberation of England from the supernatural threat that had menaced its people during those dark autumn months of 1893. The gaslit streets of London are again safe for honest citizens to walk after dark. Children play without fear in the parks and squares of the great city, and the vampire's reign of terror has become nothing more than a carefully guarded memory shared by the few who understood the true nature of the evil they had faced and defeated. Jonathan Harker has fully recovered from the physical and psychological trauma of his ordeal in Castle Dracula, though the experience has left permanent marks on his character that are visible to those who know him best. His hair remains prematurely gray, and his eyes occasionally show the haunted look of someone who has seen too much of the world's darkness, but his fundamental humanity and decency have survived intact. His legal practice has prospered, specializing in cases that involve international law and property disputes, though he has never again accepted assignments that would require travel to Eastern Europe. Mina Harker has emerged from her brush with vampiric corruption not weakened but strengthened, her natural intelligence and organizational abilities enhanced by her unique understanding of supernatural threats and the methods required to combat them. She has become an unofficial consultant to various government agencies that occasionally encounter phenomena that cannot be explained through conventional investigation. Though her official role remains that of a devoted wife and mother who manages her household with the same efficiency she once brought to the campaign against Count Dracula. The Harker's marriage has been blessed with a son, a sturdy boy named Quincy, in honor of the brave American whose sacrifice helped to secure their victory over the forces of darkness. Young Quincy Harker is a bright and curious child who delights in stories of adventure and heroism. Though his parents have agreed that the full truth about his namesake's fate must wait until he is old enough to understand the weight of such knowledge. Arthur Holmwood, now Lord Godalming in full possession of his inherited titles and estates, has channeled his grief over Lucy's death into a life of public service and philanthropy that has made him one of the most respected figures in English society. His work with charitable organizations that assist the victims of crime and violence reflects his understanding of evil's reality and his commitment to protecting the innocent from predators both natural and supernatural. Dr. John Seward has continued his pioneering work in the treatment of mental disorders, though his methods now incorporate insights gained from his study of supernatural influence on the human mind. His asylum has become a model institution that attracts students and researchers from around the world, drawn by his reputation for successfully treating cases that other physicians have dismissed as hopeless. He has never married, dedicating his life entirely to his patients and his research. Professor Abraham Van Helsing has returned to Amsterdam, where he continues his teaching and research while maintaining a vast correspondence with individuals around the world who have encountered supernatural phenomena. His experiences in England have enhanced his already formidable reputation as an expert on vampiric lore, and he is frequently consulted by authorities who find themselves dealing with cases that defy conventional explanation. The professor's private papers, carefully preserved in a vault beneath his Amsterdam home, contain detailed accounts of dozens of supernatural encounters from every corner of the globe. These records serve as both a repository of knowledge for future vampire hunters and a sobering reminder that Count Dracula, for all his power and cunning, was merely one among many supernatural predators that continue to threaten humanity in the darker corners of the world. The friends who survived the campaign against Count Dracula maintain regular correspondence and occasional reunions, bound together by shared experiences that cannot be fully understood by those who were not present during those terrible months. Their letters speak of ordinary concerns, business ventures, family news, social obligations. But underneath the conventional pleasantries runs an unspoken awareness that they remain vigilant against the possibility that other supernatural threats might emerge to challenge the safety and security of their world. Their children will grow up in an England that is safer because of their parents' courage and sacrifice, though they will never know the full extent of the debt they owe to these unsung heroes of a secret war. The official records of Count Dracula's presence in England have been carefully suppressed or explained away through conventional means, leaving future historians to puzzle over certain unexplained incidents and mysterious disappearances that occurred during the autumn of 1893. The house at Carfax has been demolished, its foundations excavated, and the earth blessed by clergy from multiple denominations before being dispersed to the four winds. The site now holds a small church dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel, whose militant spirituality seemed appropriate for a location where such a significant victory over supernatural evil had been achieved. The congregation that worships there includes several families whose lives were saved by the destruction of Count Dracula, though they remain unaware of the specific nature of the threat from which they were delivered. The warehouse district, where many of Count Dracula's earth boxes were stored, has been redeveloped into respectable commercial properties, with no trace remaining of the supernatural contamination that once made those buildings places of danger and horror. The shipping records that documented the arrival of the Demeter and its cursed cargo have been archived in government vaults, where they will remain secure from casual investigation while remaining available to those who might need such information in future crises. Dr. Seward's asylum continues to operate in Purfleet, though the building has been extensively renovated and expanded to accommodate the growing understanding of mental health treatment that has emerged from the doctor's research. The cell once occupied by Renfield has been converted into a comfortable sitting room where recovering patients can receive visits from their families, a transformation that symbolizes the victory of healing over corruption that has characterized the institution's evolution. Renfield himself did not survive the final battle against Count Dracula, his mind shattered by the breaking of the supernatural bond that had sustained his twisted existence. But his death was peaceful, and Dr. Seward's careful notes on his case have contributed significantly to the understanding of how vampiric influence affects human psychology and behavior. His final words, spoken with surprising clarity and gratitude, were a blessing upon those who had freed him from his supernatural bondage. The cemetery at Hampstead, where Lucy Westenra was laid to rest, has become a place of pilgrimage for those who understand the significance of what occurred there, though the visitors appear to be ordinary mourners paying respects to departed loved ones. Lucy's grave is always adorned with fresh flowers, placed there by friends whose love for her memory transcends the horror of what she briefly became. Her headstone bears a simple inscription that speaks of a life cut short but not lived in vain, offering no hint of the supernatural circumstances surrounding her death and resurrection. Professor Van Helsing has established a discreet network of correspondence throughout Europe and beyond, individuals who share his knowledge of supernatural threats and who can be called upon should future crises arise. This informal organization operates entirely through personal relationships and shared commitment to protecting humanity from forces that most people prefer not to acknowledge. Its members bound together by understanding rather than formal oaths or institutional structures. The weapons and protective items that were used in the campaign against Count Dracula have been carefully preserved and distributed among trusted guardians who understand their significance and proper use. Van Helsing has personally blessed additional stakes, prepared new supplies of holy water, and written detailed instructions for the creation and consecration of vampire hunting equipment should such tools ever again be needed. The professor's teaching at the University of Amsterdam has been enriched by his practical experience with supernatural phenomena. Though he is careful to present such material as historical research rather than contemporary reality, his students receive the finest education in medical science available anywhere in Europe while a select few who show particular aptitude and discretion are gradually introduced to knowledge that could prove invaluable should they ever encounter supernatural threats in their future careers. Mina Harker has compiled detailed accounts of their experiences into a comprehensive record that serves both as a historical document and as a practical manual for future vampire hunters. Her organizational skills and analytical intelligence have produced a work of remarkable clarity and usefulness, though it remains carefully guarded within their circle of friends and trusted associates. This manuscript will be passed down to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that future generations will possess the knowledge necessary to recognize and combat supernatural evil, should it ever again threaten their world. The love that sustained Jonathan and Mina through their ordeal has only grown stronger with the passage of time, deepened by shared experiences that few marriages are called upon to endure. Their partnership in facing supernatural horror has evolved into a collaboration in building a life worthy of the sacrifice made by those who fell in the struggle against Count Dracula. Young Quincy's presence in their home serves as both blessing and responsibility, a reminder that their victory was won not merely for themselves, but for future generations who deserve to inherit a world free from the threat of vampiric corruption. Arthur Holmwood's charitable work has quietly but effectively addressed many of the social conditions that made London's population vulnerable to supernatural predation. His funding of better housing for the poor, improved medical care for the indigent, and educational opportunities for disadvantaged children has created a stronger and more resilient society that would be better equipped to resist future supernatural threats. His efforts are motivated not only by genuine compassion, but by the understanding that a healthy, educated, and morally strong population is humanity's best defense against the forces of darkness. Dr. Seward's research has advanced the understanding of mental health to a degree that has benefited countless patients who might otherwise have suffered in ignorance and isolation. His work on the psychological effects of trauma, the treatment of anxiety and depression, and the rehabilitation of patients with complex mental disorders has established new standards of care that are being adopted by institutions throughout the British Empire and beyond. His knowledge of supernatural influence on human psychology remains carefully guarded, but it has informed his treatment methods in subtle ways that have enhanced their effectiveness. The friendship that bound these extraordinary individuals together in their fight against Count Dracula has endured through the years, strengthened by shared understanding and mutual respect that transcends the normal social boundaries of Victorian society. Their periodic reunions are ostensibly social occasions, but they also serve as opportunities to share information about unusual phenomena and to maintain the readiness that might be required should new supernatural threats emerge. As evening settles over London and the gaslights begin to flicker to life in streets and squares throughout the great city, ordinary citizens go about their business with no awareness of the debt they owe to a small group of heroes who once stood between them and an evil that would have corrupted their entire civilization. The children who play in the parks, the lovers who walk together through moonlit gardens, the families who gather around warm hearths in comfortable homes. All of them live in safety because a few brave souls were willing to face supernatural horror and make whatever sacrifices were necessary to preserve the world they cherished. Count Dracula is gone, his reign of terror ended, his threat to humanity eliminated through the courage and determination of those who refused to accept defeat even when facing an enemy whose power seemed limitless. But the vigilance that made their victory possible continues, maintained by individuals who understand that evil takes many forms and that the price of freedom is eternal watchfulness against forces that would destroy everything good and decent in human civilization. The story of their struggle against the vampire count will never be told in its full truth to the general public, for most people are not ready to accept the reality of supernatural evil or the necessity of the methods required to combat it. But the record of their deeds remains, carefully preserved for future generations who may find themselves called upon to face similar challenges. Their example of courage, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph serves as proof that no evil, however ancient or powerful, can permanently triumph over the combined strength of human love, determination, and faith in the ultimate victory of light over darkness. And so the tale of Count Dracula comes to its end, not with the dramatic flourishes of romantic fiction, but with the quiet satisfaction of duty performed and evil defeated through the application of knowledge, courage, and unwavering commitment to the protection of innocent life. The vampire is dead, his victims have found peace, and the world is safer for the efforts of those who were willing to pay whatever price was necessary to preserve the foundations of human civilization. In the years to come, when new threats arise and other heroes are called upon to stand against the forces of darkness, they will draw strength from the knowledge that others have faced such challenges before them and have emerged victorious. The legacy of Professor Van Helsing, Jonathan and Mina Harker, Arthur Holmwood, Dr. Seward, and brave Quincy Morris will inspire future generations of protectors, ensuring that humanity will never be left defenseless against the supernatural evils that lurk in the shadows of our world. The sun rises each morning over a London that is free from the threat of vampiric corruption, and the citizens who benefit from that freedom may never know the names of those who secured it for them. But in the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived, in the laughter of children who play without fear, and in the peace that comes with the knowledge that love and courage can triumph over even the darkest evil, the memory of their victory lives on, a testament to the power of human goodness to overcome any challenge that may arise from the depths of supernatural malevolence. Thus ends the chronicle of Count Dracula, vampire of Transylvania, and the brave souls who stood against him in defense of all that is good and pure in human civilization. May their example inspire others to similar courage, and may their victory serve as proof that no darkness, however deep, can permanently overcome the light that shines in human hearts dedicated to the cause of justice and the protection of innocent life. The end. And so ends our journey through the shadows of Transylvania and the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London. Count Dracula has been vanquished, but his legacy and Bram Stoker's masterful tale lives on forever. This has been Quick Classic Books' adaptation of Dracula, where we've distilled over 400 pages of Gothic horror into its most essential, spine-tingling moments. You've experienced every crucial scene from Jonathan Harker's imprisonment in Castle Dracula to the final confrontation that sealed the vampire's fate, all while preserving the atmospheric dread and Victorian elegance that made this story a timeless masterpiece. We hope this streamlined version has given you a deeper appreciation for Stoker's brilliant creation and perhaps inspired you to explore more of the literary treasures that have shaped our culture for generations. Whether you're discovering these classics for the first time or revisiting old favorites, Quick Classic Books is here to make the greatest stories ever written accessible to every reader. Thank you for joining us in this tale of blood, terror, and ultimate triumph. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful and your windows remain safely locked. This has been Quick Classic Books, where classic literature meets modern life.